Power is absolute justice, the only and unbreakable truth of this world. No other thing can subdue it, and if it belongs to you, it is what defines your might and greatness. With this conviction, demons enter battle to the last drop of blood, like fanatics, and their rage lasts endlessly, for this race considers power its natural gift and the unquestionable truth of existence. More than 5 centuries ago, at the moment of birth, there appeared in the world one who had no equal. His greatness was demonstrated immediately, for he was the king of demons who crushed enemies and united the world by force. He was the most powerful demon ever to appear in this world. Outwardly, he looked like a youth with luxurious blonde hair, pairs of horns, and a commanding gaze. The name of the new king of demons was Hiram. 20 years passed under his rule when Hiram, the king of demons, dared to challenge the very deity of demons, rejecting its unattainability and sacred power. At that time, the demonic god appeared in the world in his spiritual embodiment and addressed the king. He declared that even a king named Hiram must obey the will of the deity. Hiram received a divine decree to sacrifice 100 subjects daily. This became the condition of his reign, but over time such demands became unbearable and cruel for the king. He replied that this world of earth and bodies belongs only to him, and he considers it his own property, and the god should seek sacrifices in his own spiritual world or among other creatures. Hearing this, the demonic god became enraged. In Hiram's words there was both respect and insolence at the same time, but above all they were pierced by pride that touched divine arrogance. The god declared that by this Hiram directly challenges him and warned that he would perish. Immediately his divine power burst forth, filling the world with fear and trembling. At that moment the spiritual body of the demon god took physical form. And even in it, he was several times larger than Hiram, resembling a gigantic fire elemental. The god smiled, completing his transformation, and addressed Hiram. He promised to show what distinguishes a demon from a god. But the king only slightly smiled and reminded him to watch his words. Thus began the great battle that entered history. The mighty demon king and the god who descended into this world to punish the disobedient clashed. And yet the magic of Girum, which destroyed everything around, repeatedly collided with the divine miracles of the god, creating an even confrontation. But in this equality was hidden a special detail. Girum possessed an incredible variety of spells, thanks to which he became the strongest among demons, and earned the title of king. His protective barriers withstood even the god's strikes. His techniques were completely different and unpredictable. Girum surprised the enemy every time, revealing new talents and demonstrating skills that amazed even the deity. The battle itself lasted 3 days and 3 nights, bringing disasters to the world and causing terror among mortals. Both were invincible. But in a duel of such scale, there could be only one winner. Finally, at the end of the 3 days, all the attention of the demon world was focused on the result, and Girum emerged victorious. He completely destroyed the physical shell of the demon god, who fell before him. Girum noted that this was natural, as incarnation in a physical body greatly limited divine power and did not allow it to fully manifest. This was the reason for his defeat. The god could not believe in his own fall. His physical shell gradually crumbled, and he, enraged and humiliated, continued to shout that what had happened was absolute nonsense. The deity declared that Girum was too proud and reckless for a king. The god began to laugh mockingly, repeating that no demon could ever defeat the one who possesses and rules him directly. But Girum replied that this was exactly how he defeated him. The god insisted that he remained only a demon and could never escape the power of the divine hand. This was the cause of his future defeat. The god added that Girum could be proud of cornering him in this battle, but the truth is unchanging. He was born a demon and therefore doomed to perish here and now. The king's body began to crumble. It seemed as if he was turning into sand, scattering into thousands of tiny grains ready to be blown away by the wind into the void. The demon king could not believe what was happening. He looked at his own hands crumbling to dust and shouted that he did not understand what punishment God had imposed on him. The deity, laughing ominously, said that it had never thought to apply true divine punishment to a terrestrial being, as everything had been resolved before without such punishment. God explained that his words were not empty. He himself led the race of demons and had the right to take their lives at any moment, for he always stood above even the king. He looked again at Girum, who was slowly falling apart, and repeated that his protest and audacious challenge only proved the foolishness that ultimately destroyed him. Girum was engulfed in rage but could do nothing. In the end, only his head remained, staring intently and angrily directly at the deity. And then, after a few moments, the body of the demon king completely disappeared from this world, dissolving into space, and no one knew where his remains had settled. At the place where the battle took place, white gates began to open nearby, emitting a strange light. From them emerged the silhouette of one of the king's subjects. It was a very young demon, resembling a child, with blonde hair, wearing a cloak and a small ring on his neck that reminded of his belonging. The little demon, barely pushing open the huge gates for him, rushed headlong to the place where his master had just disappeared, refusing to believe in the king's defeat. He grabbed the king's cloak, clutching in his hands only fragments that looked more like pebbles than remains of a body. The child could not bear it and, trembling, whispered the name of his master. Standing on his knees, the little demon cried more bitterly, begging for an explanation of why Giram was defeated and how to now save the subjects from bloody sacrifices. Meanwhile, in a dark and quiet room, a sphere with a material shell appeared, resembling a polyhedron covered with bizarre symbols. Around its center, where a mysterious entity resided, magical circles began to form, filled with symbols and texts unknown to any earthly peoples. All these circles enveloped the child who found himself at the very center. It seemed he was just born inside this sphere, coming into the world from an unknown universe. Much time had passed since the death of the demon king Giram. Far from his castle, a month's journey or 2 months sailing away, a new birth was taking place. In a remote dark hall, a white stone lay on the floor, covered with symbols. It was a regular dodecahedron carved with Shinto signs. The infant who appeared there raised his eyes and spoke his name. Giram. He had been preparing for this moment even before the defeat in battle with the demon god. The king planned to win, but understood that his opponent was a god, and therefore had to consider the possibility of defeat. After long training, he created this stone. In the process of reincarnation, only the soul and mind are inherited, as well as spells connected to the soul. Meanwhile, the body and brain are created anew, as if from a blank sheet. And until the soul and mind settle in the new body, thoughts remain chaotic. Giram realized that in such a state he could even die of hunger. The king had no time to go through the entire path from childhood to maturity again, so he used accelerated growth magic. Using the spell, he endured hellish torments, as if every bone in his body was breaking simultaneously. He had never felt such pain before. The hall where the stone of transformation was kept was specially built for the ritual. Rising, Giram uttered the spell, and a bright light illuminated the gloomy space. The king had prepared in advance and enchanted this room with protective seals, and also left clothes for himself. He approached the chest and began to put on luxurious clothing. After this, the king began looking around, trying to understand how much time had passed since his death. In his calculations, reincarnation was supposed to occur exactly 10 years later. But given the incredible complexity of transformation magic, exact calculations were not required, and therefore the king himself was not sure if exactly 10 years had passed. Approaching the exit, he saw that the seal he had placed remained intact, and this pleased him. Opening it, he was ready to receive the answer to the question about the time that had passed. But when Giram found out that not 10 or even 100 years had passed, but a whole 500, he was stunned. He knew magic was complex, but he never imagined it could betray him so cruelly. Most likely, changing the race to human caused a malfunction in the magical formula which disrupted the term. But Giram consciously chose this change, having significant reasons for it. The punishment of the god was that he could kill demons with just a flick of his finger. Knowing this, the king adjusted the formula before his death to avoid similar consequences in the new body. The human race was considered the strongest, because they did not have divine protection. That is why humans matured very slowly and lived significantly shorter lives than other beings. If a race had its own god, it possessed a greater amount of magical powers. The more magic, the slower the aging and the longer the body's life. Those who had no god usually did not manage to become truly strong. But the human race had enormous potential for development. Therefore, if experience is preserved in memory, it can be proven that humans are the strongest race. This became the main argument for Giram when choosing a new shell. Although there were no such examples before, his body changed, the horns disappeared, and he realized that the plan worked. He looked at himself for a long time, and carefully, not fully accepting the body into which he was reborn. But at the same time, he liked the new incarnation and studied it with special interest. Now he wanted to check if he remained the strongest. Even after 500 years, his goal had not changed. He sought only one thing, to destroy the demon god. When he approached the door, he found that the outer seal was missing. Although he had applied it on both sides, it was clear that someone had tried to break into his hiding place. Opening the gate, he immediately felt the breath of warm wind. The boy opened his eyes wide in surprise, for he saw something very close that he did not expect at all. A girl with long blonde hair appeared behind the gates. Her ears were pointed like those of elves, and this was a real surprise for him to see someone here. Surprised by the meeting with a person in these parts, the girl could not say anything understandable for a long time, but then she gathered herself and asked the boy what he was doing here. She continued more confidently and warned him. If he stays here, he might die, which he probably doesn't even know. She looked at him intently. Having listened to her, he remained calm. The girl explained that a dangerous dragon sleeps on this mountain, threatening anyone who comes near. After a few seconds, the boy decided to respond. Maintaining complete calm, he first introduced himself, saying his name was Hiram. The girl, however, called herself Lumiere, and explained that she had come here to kill the dragon. Suddenly there was a strange, not too loud sound that lasted briefly. It came from the girl's bracelet. She raised her hand to her ear and answered, trying to find out the reason for the interrupted silence. After a brief conversation, she said she understood everything and would be ready. Lowering her hand, the girl looked at the boy again and called him by name. She explained that she had an urgent matter, so she could not take him to the foot of the mountain. However, she believed that he could manage on his own and still asked him again. Giram was surprised by such a question. He looked at the girl and tactfully replied that he really could take care of himself. The girl set off into the forest, raising her hand and warning him not to take risks. She promised that if he waited here, she would return for him after completing her task. She also asked him to promise that under no circumstances would he climb the mountain, repeating that it was extremely dangerous. Giram smiled, raised his hand in response, and said that he would be fine. When the girl disappeared among the trees, Giram turned back to the mountain and said that the dragon would be a more interesting matter for him than descending to the foot. He looked again at the huge mountain towering before him. By its size, it was obvious. One of the strongest ancient dragons lived here. Examining the surrounding power, he felt the mighty magic of a high dragon. By its scale, it was clear. This was truly one of the most powerful representatives of its kind. Giram moved toward the mountain, deciding that this was exactly what he lacked now. After all, after the transformation, he had not yet gotten used to his own magic, so this would be a real test. The battle, as the Demon King himself believed, was always the best way to master magic. He entered a narrow gorge in the mountain and began to advance through the darkness and uneven stone walls. A huge serpent appeared before him. Spreading his arms, Giram said that he did not mind testing his strength against this monster, although the dragon was 100 times bigger than him. Barely seeing the stranger who felt at home in his lair, the dragon became enraged. The next moment he opened his jaws to scorch the uninvited guest with fire. When the stream of flame poured onto him, Giram cast a protective spell. It completely stopped the fiery jet, leaving the Demon King unharmed. Seeing that his fire attack had no effect, the dragon decided to finish everything with a single paw strike meant to crush the young man, but Giram stopped the paw with one hand. He held back the entire onslaught with one hand, not allowing the dragon's paw to come even a step closer. The creature's astonishment knew no bounds. How could a human possess such strength? Raising his head, Giram smiled and said that the dragon's movements were truly majestic, but obviously that was not enough to defeat him. However, the ancient dragon was too powerful a creature and was not going to give up. It attacked again, directing a fiery breath towards Hiram. This time the king did not defend himself but jumped aside and, pushing off a ledge, rushed toward the tail of the huge monster, ready to attack. The flame destroyed everything in the cave, burned the ground and shattered the stones on the walls and ceiling. But Hiruma did not stop. He kept moving forward. When the fiery stream covered him again, he raised a magical shield. The flames split, sliding beside the king's body, causing him no harm. The fire, reflected by the shield, partially returned and burned the dragon itself. It staggered on its paws, and the next moment its head struck the stone floor of the cave. Finding himself right in the jaws of the monster, Hiram clung to its teeth and began to pry open the jaws, not letting the dragon close them. Then he jumped out and, using a bit of magic still holding onto his teeth, lifted the entire body of the monster until it hung over his head. When the dragon was perpendicular in the air, Hiram forcefully slammed it to the ground. A powerful roar echoed through the cave as the body fell down. Thrown to the ground, the dragon lay, breathing heavily and no longer had the strength to rise. Steam rose from its body in all directions. Hiram approached and climbed onto the dragon's head. He felt his strength and noticed that the magic that strengthened the body now worked even more effectively than in his past life. Satisfied with the victory, he clenched his fist and barely smiled. His assumptions proved correct. The human race had colossal potential for development, but the dragon was not going to give up. He gritted his teeth, gathered the remnants of his strength, and decided to attack again, even if it would cost him his life. Swinging his body, he threw Giram off and opened his jaws for the final strike, confident that the human was defenseless. Giram only smiled, paying respect to his opponent, and summoned one of his seals. The released power pressed the dragon to the ground, breaking through the stone foundation. Crushed to the ground, the dragon bowed his head and admitted that his opponent was incredibly strong. He surrendered and said he could do anything the victor desired. With a broad smile, Giram ordered him to stand up. He was surprised to hear that the creature spoke the human language. The dragon replied that he belonged to an ancient species. Giram noted that he was quite polite for a dragon and guessed it was because of youth. The dragon responded that he was 600 years old, and although that was considered young, he was already quite strong. The dragon asked why he had come and said that if he was interested in treasures, he could simply take them. But Giram replied that gold did not interest him. The dragon bared his teeth and declared that then he had come for his body. If so, then let him take it quickly, tearing off scales and fangs. Giram raised his eyes and thought that was very bold words. He liked such straightforwardness, and so he decided that he wanted to befriend this creature. The young man smiled and asked the dragon to name himself. At first the dragon was stunned, but then showed interest and agreed. The dragon rose, spread its wings, and proudly declared that he was an ancient fire dragon named Yagorn. Despite the conversation, his appearance remained formidable. Hiram was surprised, as he did not expect such a young dragon to already have a nickname. He asked if he had earned it in battle, as his dynasty did. The dragon was impressed by the youth's wisdom. He sat down like an obedient dog and even wagged his tail. Then he said that it was the first time he had seen a human with such knowledge. He bowed his head and asked to hear the name of his interlocutor. Hiram immediately responded and gave his name. The dragon's eyes widened in shock. He was stunned by the meeting and said he could not believe it. Before him was the great king of demons himself. The ancient serpent bowed his head even lower, and Hiram stopped him with a light gesture and confirmed that the dragon's guess was correct. He was indeed the king of demons. The dragon summarized that the king had truly managed to reincarnate using resurrection magic before death. Hiram was surprised that he knew his story. The dragon replied that, of course, he knew. He recalled the time when the demon almost defeated the demon god and said that this legend was known even among ancient dragons. Pausing for a moment, he added that probably for this reason he lived here in the mountains by the order of his father. Hiram was surprised to hear that it was Jorm's order and asked when exactly. The dragon said that it happened about 500 years ago when he still lived with him. He added that he had already seen Hiram, and that he really resembled the great king. Then he reminded that Hiram should remember Jormungandr, Jorm's father. What he heard impressed the youth. The dragon added that even in childhood he had managed to meet the king of demons, Jormungandr. That was the name of the great ancient dragon with whom Hiram fought many battles for power. He was the strongest opponent among all dragons in those distant times. The dragon was not only a vassal, but also a devoted friend and advisor to Giram. Jormungandr, the eldest among the ancient dragons, lived for tens of thousands of years and possessed immense power and wisdom. Giram often turned to him for advice. Perhaps that is why Jormungandr sent his son to guard the demon king, although he did not give him a direct order. The king said that now he remembered everything, for it was Jormungandr who advised him to become human. The dragon bowed his head and addressed him with respect, calling him Your Majesty. Giram recalled the moment when in his own chambers he heard advice from Jormungandr. If he were defeated in battle by the demon god, he must be reborn as a human. At that time, it seemed too risky to him, since transformation magic was already extremely complex, and the chance of success was very small. Moreover, if changing race, the probability of success became even lower. Therefore, Giram initially prepared a formula for transformation into a demon, but at the moment of death changed the spell. One of the main reasons he decided to become human was Jormungandr's advice. Giram scratched his head and admitted that he was defeated then, but earned the nickname Slayer of the Demon God. The dragon replied that Giram indeed died first, but there was one more thing he probably did not know. After the punishment, not only the body of the demon god disappeared. Jorm explained that when the god cursed Giram, his own spiritual body also suffered terrible damage, no less than the physical one. This struck the king. Hearing these words, Giram shouted impatiently, demanding that the ancient dragon tell him everything in detail. He fell silent and only stared intently at his interlocutor. Jorm continued, "Divine punishment is a terribly powerful spell, but its consequences are enormous. If struck so hard, one can even harm oneself." At that moment, Giram wondered whether divine punishment affects humans. Jorm replied that no, because divine blessing is like a collar. Therefore, punishment can only be applied to those beings who have a blessing. Hiram could not stand it and began to shout further, demanding to be told about the fate of the demon god. Jorm explained that his father assumed God created a cocoon for himself and hides in it. His spirit was so damaged that he was on the brink of death and could not return to the world of deities. Hiram bowed his head, pondering these words, and thanked the dragon for such valuable information. This meant that the god was now hiding somewhere in the physical world. Then Jorm said that he would always be at his service, bowed his head, and laid it at the king's feet. A sadness appeared in his eyes that Hiram could not understand. Jorm added that he sees no shame in defeat by the great demon king, and admitted that he is glad that it was Hiram who was the last one he met. The king replied that he was not joking when he spoke about his strength, and therefore Jorm has no reason to blame himself after this defeat. The dragon closed his eyes and thanked the king, saying that it was a great honor for him. He asked that if Hiram met his father, he should tell him that his son fought bravely and was ready to die. Hiram replied that he did not need the body of the ancient dragon. After the conversation, he understood that Jorm, as the son of a loyal vassal and friend of Jormungand, could now serve the king. He also said that he would need help because he is going to conquer the world. The dragon heard this and asked in surprise if he was mistaken. Hiram spread his arms and declared that he would first finish off the demon god, and only then would he set out on a campaign again to conquer this world, as he once did before. Realizing the seriousness of his intentions, Jorm said he was ready to cast aside the pride of the ancient dragons and henceforth serve the king as his father had done. Speaking these words, his body began to shine, light impulses appeared. Soon the glow enveloped him completely, and he rose into the air. Finally, with a stern voice, he declared that he would go with Hiram, recognizing him as his king. When the light went out, Hiram saw that Jorm had shrunk and began to resemble a small dragon. Jorm climbed onto this king's shoulder, and he noticed his agility. The dragon smiled and said he was the swiftest among the ancient dragons. Looking at him, Jorm was already waiting for orders, but Hiram said there were none yet. First, they had to find the place where the god of demons was hiding. The dragon opened his mouth wide and exclaimed that there were many treasures in the cave. He advised using them as soon as the king desired. Hiram asked Jorm if he was sure, since collecting treasures was the favorite pastime of all dragons, and he did not want to take that away from his new ally. But Jorm said he did not like treasures, and had already declared before that he was ready to give everything. He called all these coins an inheritance for the king, and then Hiram thought that Jormungand knew well about his hiding place. Together, Hiram and Jorm began to examine the riches gathered in the cave. The young man was impressed by their quantity and assumed that most of them had come here from his secret caches. The ancient dragon explained that he had collected some himself in the surrounding lands. Then he flew to one of the items, pulled it out, and noted that this thing had a very interesting shape. No matter what he said, Jorm did have an affinity for such things. All these shiny treasures and strange shapes attracted him, although in fact every dragon had their own preferences. Hiram sat down and began to look more closely at the items lying around. He learned that Jormungand had gathered everything from secret caches and left it to Jorm, since he had lived here even before the disappearance of his father. The dragon added that among the artifacts there were many strange things with their own effects, but the most valuable for him was the acquaintance with Hiram himself. The king thought that the nest was built as protection for his tomb, and when Jorm grew up, he left him here. Hiram wondered what exactly Jormungand was planning, and expressed hope that he would soon be able to see him again. Later, Hiram continued to study the treasures, while Jorm prowled somewhere nearby. He flew up with a small necklace and said that his father had ordered him to protect this item. Hiram immediately recognized the amulet that the dragon brought and asked to be given it. Jorm flew closer and handed the ornament to his lord. The king carefully took the necklace and said that, it seemed, he had once given it to Filthy as a talisman. That was why the dragon's father considered it important to preserve it. In a past life, this amulet was worn by Hiram himself. It was a magical tool that helped find Filthy if she got lost, and its glow indicated the state of her magic. The king watched over Filthy, as she was a demoness with enormous potential. The level of magic determined the lifespan, and Hiram would not be surprised if she was still alive. The amulet glowed with a green light that shimmered on the surface of the stone. Hiram realized that Filthy was alive, but could not determine her location, which was very strange. He turned to Jorm, asking if his father had told him anything about Filthy, but the dragon only shrugged and replied that he had never heard of her. Hiram looked at the necklace for a moment longer, then put it on his neck. Jorm noticed how the king's face changed, and sadness was reflected in his features. But Hiram himself assured that he was not upset, but on the contrary, happy, because he learned that Filthy was alive, and now he was obliged to find her at all costs. The king smiled and shared his decision with Jorm. He said that they would find both Filthy and the demon god. The dragon fervently supported his lord. Jorm flew very close and released a small stream of flame, which meant his approval. He promised to do everything possible, and Giram nodded, relying on him. Among the treasures was an important magical item, the magic bag. It had incredible capacity and at the same time weighed almost nothing. Giram leaned over the treasures, opened the bag, and said he would take everything that Jormungand had left him. He whispered a spell, and all the riches instantly appeared inside. Stepping out into the fresh air, he spread his arms wide and took a deep breath of the mountain coolness. Jorm hovered nearby, ready to accompany him. After a short stop, they together surveyed the area and determined the direction. Giram loudly shouted that it was time to set off, and Jorm supported him with the call, "Forward." Meanwhile, the girl whom Giram met, coming out of the transformation room, was fighting a huge monster armed with a heavy mace. At one point, the beast deflected her strike with its weapon. The elf girl jumped aside and looked at the blade, on which a crack appeared. She looked at the broken sword for a long time, not believing her own eyes. The situation was becoming hopeless, as the monster relentlessly approached her. Meanwhile, Giram had already descended from the mountain and was walking along the forest path together with Jorm. The dragon flew nearby and explained that if they moved along this road, they would soon reach the city. The king was enjoying the weather. Throwing his head back, he wanted to find out who currently ruled these lands. Jorm replied that after his death, the country fell apart and a war began. Suddenly, a loud roar was heard ahead. Giram shouted Jorm's name, urging him to be on alert. When they moved further, they saw an orc with a mace ready. They stopped at a distance where the orc had not yet noticed them. Jorm noted that this monster was too large for an ordinary orc. Giram suggested that this was probably their lord. Jorm did not understand why the orc lord was just standing in the middle of the road. He had never seen such creatures appear on the path. Giram suggested stepping off the road. But just as Hiram pulled up his hood and was ready to move in the other direction, they saw a familiar girl who was already drawing her sword and shouted her name fiercely. Lumiere Artville sternly declared that it was her duty to kill the Lord of Orcs, after which she drew her blade and aimed it directly at the monster's head. Hiram recognized the girl, which surprised Jorm. The young man said he met Lumiere near the tomb, where she confessed that she came to kill the ancient dragon. She looked confident. A fight began between the Lord of Orcs and Lumiere. The girl skillfully wielded the sword, expertly dodged the heavy mace blows, and inflicted minor wounds on the opponent. The Lord of Orcs gradually grew more and more furious, as he could not catch the agile girl. He swung his weapon in different directions, while Lumiere easily dodged and counterattacked. Jorm, watching the duel, remarked to his king that although she was still young, she was already brave like a true hero, so it was no wonder she managed to break the tomb's seal. As they watched, the ancient dragon offered to help the girl, because he was sure she could not handle such an opponent alone. And at that very moment, Lumiere's sword clashed with the Lord of Orcs' mace and began to crumble. The girl was shocked, as her blade was magical. She thought she might have been sold a fake, but gathered her courage and decided not to take her eyes off the enemy. Even with a broken sword, she rushed into attack again. It looked strange, as elves were always famous for their ability to use magic. But this girl attacked with a broken sword, stabbed it into the orc's chin, but was thrown back by a powerful blow. Hiram thought that heroes do not like to use ordinary magic. They prefer unique and powerful spells. Perhaps even she did not possess elven magic. And the moment came when it was necessary to intervene. Hiram decided to do so without hesitation. At the moment when the mace swung for the decisive blow and the girl lay unarmed on the ground, he stopped the attack of the Lord of the Orcs with one hand. Lumiere did not expect anyone to help. The next moment, Giram pierced the orc's chest with his other hand, and his palm entered right into the heart. The Lord of the Orcs did not even manage to stagger when the young man already pulled out his hand, squeezing the heart, and crushed it on the spot. The Lord's body staggered, fell to its knees, and a huge hole blackened in his chest. Giram waved his hand and calmly moved toward the elf girl. Approaching, he smiled and remarked that if she did not possess magic, then at least she must acquire a good sword, because with this she would not be able to fight. Lumiere only said in amazement that it was incredible. Giram offered the girl his hand, helping her to stand up. She gratefully accepted it and began to rise, uttering words of thanks to her savior. The king smiled again and said that it was all nonsense. The girl did not hide her surprise and noted that he had probably trained for a very long time as he had become so strong. Giram nodded and modestly confirmed that it was so. Lumiere looked him straight in the eyes and confidently said that now she owed him her life and would never forget it. Giram replied that he accepted it as information and then began to question the girl. He pretended as if he had grown up in the mountains and had only recently come out of there. Since he had saved her life, the elf girl gladly agreed to help and promised to tell everything she knew. But suddenly their attention was drawn by noise in the forest. Even several trees had been knocked down. It turned out that the roar of the battle had attracted the attention of many orcs, and these were probably the subordinates of the lord whom Giram had just killed. Yorm climbed higher, ready for a clash, but the king remained calm and asked the girl what could have so angered the orcs, but she denied everything. Lumiere shyly looked away and explained that on the way to the dragon she met a merchant who asked her to help. The girl immediately agreed to fulfill the request. Giram clarified what exactly was being discussed. The elf explained that the merchant complained about the lord of the orcs who blocked the path near the inn, so she decided to intervene. Giram nodded approvingly and said that then she should go help them, and he would take care of the rest. He took a sword out of his bag and handed it to the girl. The young man noticed that without a sword she would not be able to protect anyone. Lumiere wanted to object, but he said she should not worry about him because he had already shown his strength and would manage on his own. She accepted the gift, took a few steps back without taking her eyes off the young man, and said that she trusted him, and thanked him once again for the weapon. Then she turned around, hid the sword behind her belt, and ran to the merchants she wanted to help. Hiram turned to Jorm and apologized for giving away his sword, but the dragon replied that it was not a problem. When Lumiere stepped back, Hiram was ready. He turned to the thicket from which a crowd of orcs was already running, filling the surrounding space. The Demon King bowed his head, gazing into the crowd. Jorm expected Hiram to instantly launch an attack, draw a weapon, or use devastating magic as in the fight against him. But the boy only said the number 102, then corrected himself. 104. Meanwhile, the magical charge in his palm grew increasingly larger, expanding and gaining unprecedented power. The orcs were already a step away from the king, surrounding him from all sides and swinging swords and axes. But Hiram did not move. Yorm was surprised. Was he really going to use elemental magic? The warrior horde blocked the light falling from above on the dragon and the king. The orcs, maddened by the desire to avenge their lord, climbed over each other. Jorm was nervous, fearing for the king. But when the charge reached its limit, Hiram suddenly raised his hand and shouted the spell. 104 shots! And at that very moment, the magic burst in different directions, covering each of the enemies. Hundreds of shining rays pierced the army of orcs advancing on him and Yorm. Their bodies simultaneously halted and began to fall to the ground, then vanished into the air in an instant. Giram continued to hold the charge, his face taking on an almost mad expression. Yorm, watching all this, could not stop marveling at the strength of his king. He looked at the scorched earth and said it was incredible. The number of shots seemed unimaginable, but Hiram reminded that it was just elementary magic. Then he turned around and went in the opposite direction, saying that they were done here. Now it was time to find Lumiere. Jorm agreed, adding that although he did not like heroes, this girl had valuable knowledge. Meanwhile, Lumiere, armed with a sword given by Giram, repelled the orc attacks, protecting several frightened merchants hiding behind her back. The girl screamed and dashed forward, tightly gripping the hilt of the blade. 5 enemies stood against her, but there was no hesitation in her eyes, only the blazing fire of heroism. She skillfully wielded the blade, delivering deadly strikes, dispatching enemies one after another. Her mastery in defense was also impressive, allowing her to dodge and counterattack in time. Delivering a precise blow to the head of one of the orcs, she sharply pulled out the sword and immediately sliced the shoulder of another. He howled in pain and staggered backward. But Lumiere, caught in a battle trance, could no longer stop. She jumped up, raised her sword above herself, and with one strike cut the opponent in half. Barely landing, she realized the threat was gone but felt a sharp pain in her back. A crossbow bolt had hit her under the shoulder blade. She did not expect such a turn, since all the orcs in the clearing had already been defeated. So who was shooting then? Leaning on her sword, she tried to stay on her feet. Strength was leaving her body. Her hands trembled, dragging the blade to the ground. She decided to look back to see where the treacherous shot had come from. She fell on the grass, and 3 merchants she had helped only smiled sinisterly. One of them held the same crossbow. They slowly moved towards her. One said to the others that the girl was too stupid because she did not immediately realize she had been tricked. He added that it was time to get out of there. But before that, they surrounded the girl. The merchant with a black eye patch grabbed her sword and said it was wonderful and could be worth a lot on the market. The second kicked her body, pressing her to the ground, and declared that they would leave her here as food for the orcs. The third mockingly remarked that it was a pity to abandon such a beauty to the wilderness. Exhausted, Lumiere grabbed the grass with her hands, trying to hold on. She did not understand why they were treating her this way. Someone among them cruelly said that he had never had fun with an elf girl. Hearing her question about the reason for betrayal, they became even angrier. The leader leaned towards her, his eyes shining with cruelty. He grabbed her by the face, lifted her head, and pulled out a knife. He brought it to her face and smiled, as if to say, "They do all this for money and pleasure." He burst out laughing and leaned even closer, saying that he was eagerly looking forward to seeing despair in her eyes. For him, that was the greatest amusement. He dragged the rusty blade near her nose, enjoying her torment. Then he asked what it was like to die at the hands of those she tried to save. Clenching her face harder, he shouted, calling her the elven princess. Lumiere was in despair but tried to hold back her emotions, not showing fear. The merchants laughed, enjoying the moment, but suddenly quiet footsteps were heard behind them and a confident voice ordered them to disappear. It sounded so confident that the whole group tensed up. Everyone looked around in shock. Someone dared to spoil their fun. They saw a young man slowly walking towards them. Some of the bandits, hoping for numerical superiority, began shouting at the stranger. Giram stood before the group of bandits, hands in his pockets, and on his shoulder sat little Yorm, looking at the people with obvious irritation. The leader, who held Lumiere by the face, raised a dagger and said that the traveler looked weak, but since he was young, he could be profitably sold as a slave. The next moment the leader shouted to his accomplices to grab the boy, but Giram only smiled and said that this man was clever enough, and he was ready to accept their challenge. When the leader approached and lowered the blade, preparing to simply knock the boy off his feet, Giram suddenly straightened his arm and struck him with a fist right in the nose. The young man exclaimed that he got what he deserved for his dirty games. The bandit's body flew to the feet of his comrades, and two of them, stunned by the blow, screamed in shock. However, the leader was still alive. He rose on one hand and, raising his head, shouted that he would tear the young man to pieces. The rest drew swords and rushed to attack. 3 bandits simultaneously lunged at Giram, trying to surround him and deliver a simultaneous strike. They already realized that the boy was not as weak as they had thought, but Giram himself paid no attention to them. His gaze was fixed only on Lumiere, who lay on the ground with a crossbow bolt in her back and barely conscious. He approached the girl and asked if she was okay. Giram tried to calm her, saying that he was nearby. He took off his cloak and covered her with it, smiling. The boy said that now everything would be fine with him, so she should not worry. Now it was time for him to take care of her, as the girl's courage made a strong impression on him. Lumiere raised her eyes and quietly thanked her savior. She wrapped herself in the cloak he gave her, and her voice sounded very weak but sincere. It seemed that Giram had fallen in love with her. He sat down next to her, stretched out his hand, placed it on her forehead, and whispered one word: healing. At that moment, Jorm had already flown up to his king. When Giram spoke the spell, his palm flared with bright light, and this initially frightened Lumiere. But after the outburst, the girl sighed, whispered words of gratitude, and felt relief. She barely managed to say that she felt better when she immediately lost consciousness. Giram was surprised because the girl fainted after his spell. His healing magic was too strong, and he realized he had to use it more carefully. Demons have always found it difficult to master healing magic, but now, in a human body, the power of some spells has significantly increased. Hiram stood up. He took a few steps toward the leader, who was still alive lying on the ground. Hiram sat on him from above and opened the bag, and the bandit screamed in pain and asked why he was protecting the elf woman. The king, sorting through the looted artifacts, tried to assess their value. He raised his head and asked if they happened to be involved in slave trading. Rummaging through the things, he came across an urn with an image of an orc skull. It immediately became clear. This was a magical item for luring orcs. Continuing to search the bag, he took out another item, a necklace amulet that had the power to ward off orcs. It looked extremely suspicious. Then Hiram realized that these bandits used things to lure orcs as well as for their own protection. The picture of events began to form in his mind. It was a trap to kill Lumiere. And indeed, at first it seemed strange why Lord Orc stood right in the middle of the road, and then the orcs suddenly attacked in a pack, but not from the bandits' side. The merchants turned out to be just a cover. For the bandits, such artifacts were too expensive, so most likely, they were handed over to them by some powerful mage who wished death upon Lumiere. A complete understanding of the situation formed. Hiram leaned over the leader and pressed his boot against his head, making him groan in pain. He grabbed him by the face and shouted sharply, demanding to say who organized all this and hired their group. Giram placed an urn for luring orcs in front of the bandit and began interrogation, demanding to tell where they got such things. The leader writhed in pain but insisted he knew nothing. He said he just took the bag from a mage they once robbed. Giram tilted his head and said he did not understand at all why he was covering for his client. He guessed that it was most likely really a mage. The bandit shouted so loudly that Yorm, who was sitting on his head, covered his ears. But even then he repeated that he did not know any mage. When Giram broke all the fingers on his hand, he thought, maybe the bandit really knew nothing, or the fear of the mage was greater than the fear of death. Yorm suggested that this was quite possible. Giram released the bandit's hands and stood up, saying that without the necessary information the city would become a dangerous place for all three. Then he approached Lumiere and began to lift her into his arms. The girl needed to be immediately taken out of this place. Yorm flew up and offered to spare the bandits. But Giram replied to the dragon that he had another idea. He picked up from the ground an amulet that repelled orcs and said that it was this one they would take with them. Yorm agreed, understanding that the lure urn would remain in place. Giram confirmed, saying that the rules always change and only the lucky survive. Soon several orcs ran to the clearing, attracted by the magical artifact. They rejoiced at the unexpected find and quickly dealt with the bandits. After walking several kilometers, Lumiere began to regain consciousness. She opened her eyes and saw that Giram was carrying her in his arms. She did not expect such awakening at all. She quietly asked to be put down on the ground, saying that she could already stand. Leaning on the boy, she carefully began to stand up. Giram asked if she was all right. Lumiere replied that she felt fine and sincerely thanked him not only for the help but also for the sword he had given her. The boy smiled and said that it was a trifle for him. He did not need that weapon because he had something much more important. But the girl objected, noting that the sword was extremely expensive. This was evident from the quality of the blade and the decorations with precious stones. Hiram replied that if she wanted, he would return it in the city. Lumiere adjusted her clothes and thanked him once again. She agreed to his terms and inquired about what would happen to those merchants. Giram with a slight smile said that they were not merchants at all, but just a gang of ordinary robbers. He added that maybe the orcs had already eaten them, since he saw their pack very close by. The girl's face changed, and Giram immediately asked what had happened. Lumiere turned away and clenched her hands, trying to hide her anxiety. Hiram said they should go to the city because he would not be able to carry dozens of bodies alone. But the girl bowed her head and replied that she did not know if she was ready to return. She had a mission, to kill the ancient dragon, and she could not abandon it. Giram recalled her previous words and confirmed that he heard it. Yorm, however, hissed skeptically that she was unlikely to defeat such an enemy. The boy just smiled and assured her that she had nothing to worry about. He himself climbed the mountain, talked to the ancient dragon, and made him leave his dwelling. Lumiere could not believe her own ears. She looked at the smiling Giram in surprise and did not understand how a person could make a dragon leave its own domain. They moved further along the path. Giram said that now they could calmly proceed to the city. But the girl objected, saying she did not believe his words and wanted proof. Then Giram smiled again and replied that in that case a witness was needed. He pointed to Yorm, and they both laughed. After that, Giram said he would like to learn more about the country they were in. Lumiere recalled her promise and after a short pause began her story. She explained that they were currently in the kingdom of Orteval. Giram's eyes widened because he had already heard this name and was extremely surprised. He addressed the girl and said that it was her surname. She confirmed, explaining that she was the daughter of the king and the first princess of the kingdom. Giram remembered how the bandits called her princess when he approached from behind the trees. This meant they knew well who she was, and it only confirmed his suspicions. He looked at her and asked her to tell the whole story about the country where she lived. Lumiere smiled and said she would keep her word, so she started from the very beginning. She told that about 100 years ago a great state united the continent, and the rulers of this power were the elf dynasty of Orteval. At that time, elves were considered the most respected race on the entire continent. Following them were beast folk and dwarves. The lowest and weakest was considered the human race, as it did not have divine blessing. Elves oppressed humans for many years, and Lumiere, as part of the royal family, believed that this was why the bandits hated her so fiercely. What she said deeply affected Giram. Meanwhile, the girl, now fully recovered and healed, stood up and told this to the demon king who was reborn in a human body. Lumiere pressed her lips and crossed her arms over her chest. She sincerely hoped that Giram could forgive her for the legacy she carried with her. The boy turned to her and decided to clarify a few points. He asked if she really hated the human race and wanted to subjugate people just as her ancestors had done. But Lumiere immediately changed her facial expression and said that this was not the case at all. Giram's assumptions were wrong and she hastened to deny them. Giram approached, tilted his head, and said that this was exactly what he wanted to hear from the elven princess. Lumiere began to speak hesitantly, trying to explain her position. She said that as a member of the royal family, She bore the burden of guilt for the actions of her people. Her dream was to correct the situation and stop the elves' domination. But she herself could do nothing. Giram saw sincerity in her words. He replied that, from his observations, the girl did not oppress people but, on the contrary, tried to help and protect them, as was the case with the merchants. The girl leaned toward him and sadly confessed that she had tried many times to change the situation, but it was all in vain. She considered herself powerless. Giram only smiled and said that he had no reason to hate her, so he held no grudge against her. He added that among the elves there are both bad and good representatives, just as among humans. This is natural, and she should not be ashamed of who she is. Lumiere was impressed by how well Giram understood everything, and this only aroused warm feelings in her. She smiled and thanked him for his understanding. They moved on together, and Giram decided to ask a few more questions. He inquired about the lands of the demons, and the girl replied that according to rumors, there is a whole continent somewhere ruled only by demons. The boy noted that he had noticed Lumiere said almost nothing about this race. He continued to pretend that he grew up in the mountains and knew nothing. Lumiere continued to trust him, unaware of who he really was. She said that she knew almost nothing about demons, as she had met them here very rarely. Meanwhile, they were approaching the city that appeared from behind the hills. It was a large castle with numerous towers, well fortified and surrounded by high walls. Lumiere began to continue telling. About 300 years ago on this continent, there were real historical upheavals involving the races of demons and elves. A brutal war raged between them. The demons were extremely strong, and the elves suffered heavy losses. It was a real massacre between the two armies. And ultimately the elves won the victory, pushed back the demons, and drove them out of the continent, fully establishing control over their mighty kingdom. This event was called the Holy War, because it was then that all the elven clans united and reclaimed the continent from the demons. On the road they passed workers who recognized the princess. They greeted her joyfully, and she responded with dignity. Meanwhile, Hiram pondered what he had heard. He was walking forward when he heard the girl catch up to him, calling him by the name Demon King. She smiled and continued their conversation. Lumiere asked where he was going to stay overnight in the city. The boy replied that he had just come down from the mountains and, of course, had no plans. Then she suggested staying at the royal residence. The estate had enough space to provide him with a separate room. She promised that he would have a comfortable bed and the opportunity to bathe after the travels. Hiram nodded, saying that sounded wonderful. Lumiere was glad that he liked her proposal, and said that now they had decided everything. Hiram replied that he was happy to meet the princess. He raised his hand and called Jorm to climb onto his shoulder. The dragon obediently flew up and settled near his king. The girl was enchanted by this spectacle. The little dragon seemed remarkably cute to her, and she began to look at it more closely. Giram named it. Lumiere saw such a creature for the first time, and was amazed that the dragon obeyed Giram. She timidly asked if she could pet this strange animal. The boy smiled and allowed it, which surprised Jorm. They were already approaching the tall gates leading to the magnificent elven city. Giram raised his eyes to the flag fluttering above them, and Jorm hid behind his shoulder, hiding from the girl's gaze. Lumiere said that only a few minutes remained. Well-armed guards with massive spears stood by the gates. Giram and the princess were heading towards them, passing by other inhabitants. The people sincerely rejoiced at Lumiere's return. They waved their hands and smiled, demonstrating that the Orteval dynasty was held in great esteem among the elven people. As soon as they entered the city, they were immediately surrounded by a crowd of joyful townspeople. The people sincerely rejoiced at the princess's return, shouting compliments and welcoming words, filling the streets with noise. Lumiere realized that she had truly made them worry. Meanwhile, Giram walked behind her, with Jorm on his shoulder, whistling a calm melody and observing everything around. The guards carefully scrutinized the boy, noticing no signs of the higher race in him. They exchanged glances, but Giram calmly continued walking towards the princess. Seeing him, Lumiere turned and pointed at the young man with her hand. She asked the people to remain calm, and said that it was Giram who managed to convince the ancient dragon to leave the mountain. The people instantly rushed to the boy, surrounding him from all sides. They thanked him for caring for the princess, as saving a person of noble lineage was considered a true feat. This lasted almost the entire way as they moved through the central square, and only after half an hour did the crowd begin to disperse. Giram leaned against one of the walls and said that finally everything was over, and they managed to break free from the crowd. He exhaled heavily, raised his head, and moved on. Jorm noticed that the inhabitants, among whom were people, sincerely loved their Princess Lumiere. Giram replied that he noticed something strange. There was not a single girl from the Night Order next to her, and for a member of the royal family this looked unusual. Soon Lumiere raised her hand and joyfully shouted to Jiram that they had arrived. Joy shone in her eyes, and it was clear that the energy of the crowd had given her strength. She, like a true mistress, walked ahead and showed the estate. Jiram glanced at the magnificent mansion and respectfully noted that the princess truly lived in beauty. Lumiere approached the door and explained that she received this house after moving to the city when she headed the Third Night Order. The doors opened, and maids dressed in black dresses with white aprons were already standing on the threshold. They bowed to the mistress simultaneously. The princess led them inside and told Jiram that from now on he could feel at home here, rest and regain strength as much as he wanted. Looking around, she noticed that everything was ready for their return, as if the servants had known about the arrival in advance. She said that dinner was already set, and invited everyone to the table. Yorm, seeing the variety of dishes, could not resist hunger and jumped onto the table. He began greedily eating everything in sight, which greatly surprised Lumiere. The dragon darted between the plates, sweeping delicacies one after another. When almost half the table was empty, he collapsed to the side and sighed heavily, indicating that he was full. Lumiere, kind by nature, helped the maids tidy up. Then she approached Jiram and placed a cup of hot tea beside him. The fragrant drink steamed, and Jiram, like a true nobleman deep in his soul, carefully took the cup and took the first sip. Soon the girl sat next to him and began to question him. She noted that he was a human, but at the same time possessed wonderful healing magic, which greatly surprised her. The boy, sipping tea, replied that there were various reasons for this. To be honest, it was probably due to the hardening he gained in numerous battles. Then Jiram leaned forward and said that her questions sounded as if she was worried because, being an elf, she herself did not know how to use magic. Silence fell. The girl did not know how to react to being exposed by him. Meanwhile, Jiram glanced at Yorm, who was dozing right on the table. Eventually, Lumiere admitted that his assumptions were correct. She really did not possess magic. Royal blood obliged her to go into military service and lead the Third Order. But due to the lack of magic, the knights did not recognize her authority, and this created great problems in governance. So soon she began to be called the clumsy princess, a shame of the royal family. Jiram raised his head and said that now everything was clear. He guessed that this was why the girl went alone to the mountains, trying to tame an ancient dragon. Lumiere could no longer endure it. She sharply stood up, and the cup fell from her hands, breaking on the floor. Jiram looked at her in surprise, and the girl shouted his name. She loudly declared that above all she wanted to learn magic. It was precisely for this reason she met Jiram, and now she wished for him to become her mentor. Determination was felt in her words. Jiram did not expect such a proposal, and was frankly surprised. He raised his head and asked the princess why he should teach her magic. The girl replied that among all races humans are considered the weakest in using magic, but his skills surpass even the elves, and this deserves respect. Hearing the girl's request, Jiram only smiled, not yet knowing what to answer. But at that very moment, Yorm began jumping on his hind legs, with wild eyes, imitating outrage. After several jumps, the ancient dragon sharply changed tactics, fell to the ground, and played dead. This was his way of trying to show his king that the heroine should not be taught magic. Jiram leaned toward him, gently took his head in his hands, and quietly whispered that this could become a rather interesting activity. The dragon still lay silently, feigning indifference. Then Jiram turned around and said that since they had come this far, he wanted to be completely honest with Lumiere. He warned that she might not even believe his words. Then he explained that he was not an ordinary person, although he had taken part in many battles, and was not from this world at all. The princess looked at him and understood nothing. Then Jiram changed his tone and said that in this world he was only reborn with a human body, but in reality belonged to another race. He admitted that in his world he was a demon, moreover, the very king of demons. Then he asked the girl if she had ever heard of the demon king Hiruma. Lumiere tensed, her face turned pale. She closed her eyes, shook her head from side to side, showing denial. She knew nothing about him or his past. Jorm sat in the master's hands with a displeased expression on his face. Hiram stroked the dragon and said he was not surprised, as it was about events that happened 500 years ago. He summed up briefly. He was a demon, and at the same time their king. After that, he directly asked the girl if she had changed her mind about asking him for training. Then she raised her head and replied that just as there are bad and good among elves and humans, there must also be different kinds among demons. Determination was felt in her words. She clenched her hands and said that the Demon King is a true master of magic, and if he agrees to become her mentor, it will be the greatest happiness for her. Jiram cast a glance at the satisfied princess. He expected a different reaction, but instead saw only joy in her words and feelings. Perhaps because he had already confessed that he was the king of his people, the girl decided to observe etiquette. She lifted the edges of her dress, bowed, and addressed him by name. Her face looked remarkably gentle and sincere. She repeated the request once more, begging Jiram to teach her and reveal the secrets of magic. He calmly replied not to call him teacher. Hearing that he had agreed to teach her what was necessary, the princess jumped for joy. She grabbed his hand and sincerely thanked him, realizing that he had given his consent. Jiram explained that the title teacher for the princess's person could attract unnecessary attention, and he would not want to have to correct the consequences later. The girl indignantly objected, saying that a teacher is a teacher, and it is hard to call him otherwise. Then, after thinking a little, she decided to call him Giram-san. Jiram looked out the window. Night had already fallen outside, and bright stars shone in the sky. He had the feeling that someone was watching them, but Lumiere distracted him by suggesting he take a bath. She reminded him that he had been traveling and must be tired. Jiram agreed. Meanwhile, on a tree behind the manor, a lonely black raven sat and closely watched the events in the princess's house. When Jiram stepped away from the window, the bird looked inside one last time, then spread its wings and flew upward. It was too large for an ordinary raven, as if magical. Later it began to descend. As it turned out, it was flying toward the mountain where the ancient fire dragon Jorm once lived. The silhouette of a creature was visible in the cave. The figure moved deeper and suddenly noticed a shiny coin on the floor. Remnants of the king's treasures. A man resembling Jiram from a past life, with horns on his head, picked up a coin and began examining it. Then a raven flew into the cave and perched on his shoulder. The bird croaked something to its master. The demon listened attentively and seemed irritated by what he heard. In a few seconds, while the raven continued to speak, the demon clenched the coin tightly, and it began to bend in half between his fingers. Leaving the cave, he smiled broadly. The crumpled coin was in his hand, and from his lips came the malicious hiss of a name. Jiram. Meanwhile, Jiram himself sat on the body of the demon god, his wings spread, his eyes glowing with rage. But suddenly he was distracted by a loud noise that grew stronger and stronger. Turning around, he saw a girl running toward him. It was the same demoness Filthy. Jiram rejoiced and began calling her by name. In a few seconds, Filthy was still running to the king of demons, but suddenly a blow struck the girl in the back. Jiram immediately jumped down and rushed to help the demoness, wildly searching with his eyes for the one who dared to do such a thing. She screamed in a plaintive voice, and then the demon god appeared above her. He opened his chest armor and began to consume the girl. Jiram stretched out his hands, shouted, but she was already sinking inside. Jiram screamed and reached forward until suddenly he came to his senses. He was lying on a bed in Princess Ordeval's mansion. His heart was pounding, and his head was still foggy. Drops of sweat ran down the body of the king of demons. He was gripped by fear and grabbed his head, realizing it was only a terrible dream. Behind him, Jorm was peacefully snoring, wrapped in a blanket. Jiram slowly got up and sat on the edge of the bed. He was troubled by the scene where he tried to save Filthy, but his attempts were in vain. He had not seen horrors in his dreams for a long time. Suddenly, women's shouts were heard from the street. Jiram approached the window and saw Princess Lumiere practicing with a wooden sword, working on strikes and movements. The boy got up from the bed and grabbed his clothes. He called Jorm, who was still dozing. The dragon, rubbing his eyes, joked that elves really know how to make beds. Hiram put on a black shirt and smiled, replying that yes, they were clearly better than dragons at this task. Jorm grimaced, and together they went down the stairs to the kitchen. Meanwhile, the princess had already entered the house, wiping sweat with a towel after training. She greeted the guests, to which Hiram responded with a smile and a nod. One of the maids invited them to breakfast. 2 plates with dishes stood on the table. Hiram sat down and praised Lumiere for training since early morning. At that moment, Jorm climbed onto the table and, clutching the tablecloth with his hind legs, began pulling the food toward himself. Lumiere laughed and asked the guests about their plans for the day. Jiram took the fork, thought for a moment, and said he had no special business, so he was completely free. He looked at the girl again and made a proposal. The boy bowed his head and smiled, saying that today they could practice magic if the princess really wanted to. Jorm immediately widened his eyes. Lumiere beamed with joy. She smiled broadly and exclaimed that this was exactly what she had hoped for. Her answer came without any hesitation. Jiram leaned back relaxedly and confirmed that he was not joking. The girl, full of happiness, waved her arms, showered words of gratitude, not hiding her emotions. After breakfast, everyone went out to the backyard where the girl had already been training earlier. Hiram looked around the space, folded his arms, and began to explain that magic is divided into 2 types. He decided to start with the basics. To some extent, he explained. Every person is capable of using the magic produced by their body. Lumiere was surprised by what she heard. Giram continued. It is indeed so. Otherwise, she would not have been able to resist the orc on the road even with a damaged sword. Her body was already working as a conductor then. While Yorm was chasing butterflies like a child, Giram stood in front of the girl and continued explaining the basics. Having caught Yorm and taken him in his arms, he added that only those who are unable to use magic outside the body are called powerless. You can't learn everything in one day, so they will start with the foundation. Giram scolded Yorm for mischief and put him on the ground, which made the dragon sad. Then he ordered Lumiere to stretch out her hands. She obediently complied. The boy also stretched out his hands and focused his energy. He explained that you need to imagine how the streams of magic flow through the body and converge in the palms. The princess repeated his movements, listening carefully to every word. Giram emphasized that the main thing is to concentrate and feel how the magical flow comes out. He noticed that Lumiere had huge reserves of strength, and her control was also quite high. But to master complex magic of the hero, she would have to work a lot on the basics. This is exactly how you can safely unlock potential and learn to use the magic of the high elves. After an hour, the girl's hands began to tremble from the strain. Giram stood with his eyes closed, but hearing her heavy breathing, he opened them. Convulsions were already covering Lumiere's whole body. It was extremely difficult for her to endure the lesson. When the strength almost left the girl, Giram lowered his hands and said that was enough for today. He praised her diligence, and she fell to the ground, leaning on her hands. The boy approached the bench, took a towel, and handed it to the princess. He said that now she must train every day in her free time. All sweaty, Lumiere stretched out her hand and took the towel. She smiled and assured that she understood, and would now be more diligent. Seeing that the sun was still high, Giram suggested taking a walk around the city. He was curious to see how people live and what they do. At first, the girl was a little surprised by Giram's proposal. She silently stared at him, trying to understand his thoughts, while Yorm impatiently stomped nearby, waiting for any kind of reaction. Eventually, the princess replied that if Giram truly wished for this, she would show him the entire city. She could arrange a tour for him to make it easier for him to get accustomed. Giram thanked and added that Lumiere is a princess, so together they would stand out too much in the crowd. But the girl objected, saying she could disguise herself. After these words, Hiram agreed, and Lumiere went inside to choose appropriate clothing. The Demon King and Jorm stayed outside waiting for her. After some time they heard her voice, and when they turned around they were struck by a completely new image of the princess, which seemed unusual to them. The girl apologized for the delay. She disguised herself very well. She had fox ears and a fluffy tail, and her clothes resembled those of an ordinary city dweller. Giram approached and asked if it was really her disguise. She confidently replied that it was, since no one would recognize her like that. But Yorm immediately grumbled that it was visible from afar. The princess decided that the beast people's clothing was too simple, so they would not be able to recognize her. Then she asked Giram to address her as Lumi. This, in her opinion, was a wonderful idea, because if he called her by her real name, they would have been immediately exposed. Hiram smiled and agreed. The city turned out to be surprisingly beautiful. Clean streets, many old lanterns, and wonderful architecture. Bright flags fluttered on the rooftops. When Hiram and Yorm were inspecting the goods on the shelves, a little girl ran up to Lumiere and called her a princess, but she asked her to be quiet so as not to reveal her status. Giram, enjoying the views, approached the princess standing by the stall and noted that the elves truly build remarkably beautiful cities. She, choosing pastries, replied that only wealthy townspeople live here, and explained that she did not intend to lead him further. Taking the basket, she moved on. Giram and Yorm did not understand exactly where the princess was going, so they silently followed her. She was heading towards the outskirts of the city, closer to the main gate. The surrounding appearance here was completely different. Instead of elegant benches and statues, this part looked poorer. People lived modestly here. Little children immediately surrounded the princess, calling her sister Lumi. She gave them the buns she had bought and gently inquired about their lives. The children also looked with interest at the boy who came with her. They playfully ran around him, ate sweet pastries, and Hiram watched them for a long time. His attention was drawn to a boy with a bandaged arm. He leaned down to the child and said he could heal him if he stood still. Giram raised his hand and spoke a healing spell. A flash of light illuminated the space. The bandages unfolded and fell to the ground, and the boy's hand became completely healthy. The children shouted joyfully, jumped and clapped their hands. Someone exclaimed that it was wonderful to meet a real healer, as they had never seen such magic before. At that moment, a boy approached from behind and looked at the little dragon with curiosity. He said it was very cute, and these words touched Giram. He remembered little Filthy, who once looked at the baby dragon the same way and brought it to show him this beauty. Lumiere rejoiced and said that the dragon was really very cute. It was Jormungandr when he was just born, and even the old dragon was moved then. Giram smiled and patted the boy who reminded him of Filthy. Meanwhile, several children ran up and began to look at Jorm. The little dragon rose into the air, fluttering its wings. The children watched him with delight and could not take their eyes off him. Jorm felt pleasure from their admiration. There were more children. They ate well and now played together with Hiram and Lumiere. The Demon King felt genuine joy and did not even hide it. When the children dispersed, Hiram and the princess sat on the stone fountain to have a little snack. The girl said that he was very kind to children, and she noticed it immediately. At that time, Jorm was the center of children's attention. The little dragon seemed to sense their mood and began playing with them, soaring now to one side, now to the other. Hiram was chewing bread, then raised his head and said that, probably, his kindness was connected to the fact that in these children he saw Filthy. The princess asked again, because she knew nothing about her. Giram sighed heavily and said that Filthy was a girl he raised when he was the king of demons, adding that she was only 10 years old at the time of his death. The girl was touched by the story about the little demoness, and she asked the Demon King if he still worried about her. Hiram silently nodded, approvingly confirming her words. After a short pause, he said that 500 years had passed since then. But he is sure that she is alive because he found out about it with the help of a magical artifact. In that time, she must have become very powerful. Giram raised his head again and admitted that he would like to meet her at least once in this life. He was curious about how she lives now, after so many centuries. But their conversation was interrupted by a woman who approached closer, thanking Sister Luma for another help. The princess bowed to her, attentively listening to the words of gratitude. The woman approached and bowed her head low. Lumiere inquired about a certain man, and she replied that he was much better now, after which she thanked sincerely once again. The next moment, an elderly man approached and asked Lumi to listen to him, but she folded her hands and explained that she was currently showing the city of Hirumu, so she could not stop for long. The boy smiled and said that she should not worry. In his opinion, this was also part of the excursion, as he was interested in hearing what people around were saying. While Lumiere was exchanging news with the residents, Giram stepped aside and sat down. At that moment, Jorm flew up to him, calling his king. The dragon took off and said that the girl was, of course, wonderful because she listened to everyone. But he doubted whether she had enough strength to solve all these problems. Giram looked at the crowd around the princess and agreed that she was hardly capable of handling everything at once. Jorm added that people turned to her for advice and hope. Nearby sat two old men who were quietly talking. One of them said that the princess even listened to such lost people as they were. The second added that this was exactly what made her beautiful. Giram became interested and decided to join the conversation. He asked if they could tell him something, to which the old man replied that the boy could ask anything. Giram wanted to learn more about the princess. The old man said that she even came to the slums to listen to ordinary residents, conveyed their words to the Lord, and tried to change something. The man emphasized that if they had addressed the Lord directly, he would not even have listened to them, and perhaps would have thrown them into prison. Then Giram asked about the Lord himself. The old man explained that things with the Lord were bad. He was a former official who bribed the then chancellor and thus gained power, becoming the Lord. Suddenly, one of the men stopped and pointed a finger at Giram. He called him by name, which surprised the young man, as no one had called him that for a long time. The old man continued, saying that he knew about Giram's power. He asked him to watch over the princess, as every step she took was under the surveillance of the Lord's people, and the situation was very dangerous for her. Giram did not understand why the girl's position was so difficult, and asked for a more detailed explanation of what exactly was happening in the city and the kingdom. The elder began the story. The chancellor's daughter married the king and gave birth to a prince. The chancellor sought to place the boy on the throne at any cost. The obstacle to this was the princess herself, who was sincerely loved by both the nobles and the common people. She had enormous authority among all classes. To reduce her influence, the chancellor struck at her knights who supported her in the capital. Then the Lord sent the princess here, far from power. The chancellor's faction concentrated all power in the royal court. The king himself became a puppet, as he was already old and weak, and the Lord skillfully exploited this. Giram pondered. He realized that Lumiere was left completely without allies, neither at court nor among the knights. She was lonely and surrounded by enemies. The elder added that despite this, the girl did not lose her smile, and did everything possible for the common people. All the inhabitants of this city were sincerely grateful to her. Having finished the story, Both men bowed to Giram and asked him to protect the princess from vile elves and humans who might harm her. Giram bowed his head, smiled, and promised to do everything in his power. The men rejoiced at what they heard, and one of them extended his hand to him. Giram shook it, after which the elder said that the girl had no strong allies at all, and she desperately needed their support. They thanked the young man once again. The next morning, Lumiere trained again with Giram, practicing magic. The young man was surprised at how quickly she was progressing. She could already concentrate energy. The princess rejoiced at her success, as everything was working out. This indicated that they were moving in the right direction. She raised her hands and greedily inhaled the air. Meanwhile, a maid approached them with a tray on which cool drinks stood. Giram thought that this was how it should be. After all, the heroine's powers were developing at an abnormal speed. The maid arranged the glasses, and Hiram finished the training. The princess thanked, and Yorm also received a glass with a drink and immediately began greedily slurping, enjoying the taste. After tossing back half a glass of lemonade, Yorm tilted his head and exclaimed with delight that this was truly an amazing drink. The girl, hearing his words, turned to the little dragon in surprise. Giram approached and explained that Yorm was actually an ancient dragon whom she was once ordered to destroy. Then he sternly told him to be silent because a talking dragon could scare the inhabitants. The princess was amazed that the ancient dragon was under the control of Hiram. She could not believe that the young man was capable of subduing such a giant who once lived on the mountain. Giram looked away to the side and confirmed her words, noting that now he hopes, having learned the truth, she will not turn away from the dragon and will watch over him together with him. The girl carefully took the little dragon in her arms, gently began to stroke it, and said that she would gladly take care of him. She was happy to meet a new friend. Yorm broke free from her hands, rolling his eyes, and sarcastically said that he was very glad too. The princess ignored this and continued to caress him as if nothing had happened. When they rested a bit after classes, Hiram announced that he would go for a walk around the city with the dragon. The princess saw the guests to the door and waved goodbye to them. Having taken a few steps, Hiram saw a group of wealthy townspeople standing on the street and looking ahead. From behind their backs came a noise. He quickly pushed through the crowd, shoving others aside to find out what was happening, and soon saw 2 children on the ground moaning in pain. One boy croaked that they only wanted to deliver a request to Princess Lumiere, but the guards drove them out of the wealthy district, meeting them with hostility. One of the guards kicked and ordered them to leave, calling the children annoying and dirty, and also added that they belonged to a base race. Giram did not take long to figure things out. He sharply jumped forward and flew into the conflict. His strike knocked back one guard, and that man's body hit another, clad in armor. The Demon King did not even use all his strength, but the blow was precise. The warriors flew several meters and crashed into the wall. Giram immediately turned to the children, checking their condition. One of the boys with wide-open eyes whispered that the young man was incredibly strong. Giram replied that the guard was too weak, then asked what had happened. The children spoke in unison, explaining that monsters had appeared on the outskirts of the city. They were breaking through deeper and deeper. The road was blocked. People could not escape because they were being held back. Giram listened carefully and said he understood everything. He voluntarily offered to help, saying he was setting off immediately. The children agreed to show the way, and all together they rushed forward. Meanwhile, a huge orc was approaching the city, destroying houses and killing peaceful residents on its path. People were running in panic toward the city gates. But the iron gates were locked. The frightened crowd pressed around them, and behind, everything was collapsing under the blows of the orcs. People begged to open the passage, otherwise they would all be destroyed, but the guards ignored their cries. One of the sentries shouted that if the gate was opened, the monsters would break inside. The lord nearby confirmed this, stating that those miserable people were a dirty race, and their lives did not matter. People begged to spare at least the children, but their pleas were in vain. The elves gathered near the gates to indifferently watch the approach of the bloody disaster. The lord with a staff proclaimed that the lives of elves were much more valuable than the lives of some people. Meanwhile, behind his back, the roar of battle and the clinking of weapons were heard. When he turned around, he saw a wounded guard before him, barely breathing and trying to say something. The man muttered a few words, addressing the lord. It was Giram. He had already managed to destroy several guards and now stood before the lord. The Demon King declared that if he did not want to protect the people, he must renounce his power. After a short pause, Hiram struck another guard who tried to grab his leg, and added that the lord should take an example from Lumiere, who sincerely cared for her people. These words angered the guards. One shouted indignantly, "How dare some stranger speak so boldly about their master?" and ordered preparations for the execution of the insolent boy. The guards closed in and surrounded Hiram. but with one powerful strike to the ground, he raised a wave of force that threw the attackers away, making them fly back. Having dealt with most of them, he directed his gaze at the Lord. He stepped forward, ready to teach him a lesson, when the Lord shouted indignantly that the stranger was taking too many liberties. The Lord raised his staff, which began to glow, gathering magical energy. Streams of power thickened around him, and he shouted angrily that Hiram deserved death. Moments later, a huge fiery core formed at the top of the staff. The Lord, filled with rage, aimed it at the youth and shouted for him to die. The fireball flying toward the youth resembled a dragon's attack, which Hiram had already faced in the cave during the battle with Jorm. A powerful explosion lifted stone slabs of the road into the air, but Hiram remained unharmed. He flawlessly managed to hold back the magical onslaught, deflecting the spell. His defensive magic shone at the highest level. Absorbing the flames, Hiram gradually clenched his fist, and the fireball began to shrink, melting right in his palm as if swallowed by an invisible abyss. As the dust began to settle and the crowd eagerly tried to see what remained of the youth who dared to defy the Lord, Hiram suddenly jumped out of the darkness, reaching his hand to the Lord's neck. Grabbing the Lord by the throat, he easily lifted him off the ground. The Demon King coldly said that if he already knew how to cast spells, he should also know how to fight. Raising his head even higher, Hiram added that together with the knights, their forces would be enough even against the Orc Lord. The Lord tried to break free, but it was too late. In despair, he exclaimed that Hiram was a fool for not understanding why the Lord of the Elves should risk his life for a base race. To this, the young man only sighed heavily. He replied that before him was only a stubborn ram with an inflated ego. Then with one motion he threw Lord into the air, wanting to show what awaits those like him. The Lord, bound by fear, flew in complete despair above the city gate, heading straight for the monsters that were advancing. His scream echoed for a long time until he fell. He hit the ground with tremendous force, but it was not enough to kill the tall elf. Rising, the Lord saw before him a huge orc already charging at him. Meanwhile, Hiram, having pushed aside the Lord, turned to the guards. While they looked at each other in confusion, he asked if they would go save their master, for whom they had just shouted so fervently. The knights stood trembling but tried not to show fear. One ordered Hiram to be silent, yet none of them hurried to help the Lord who was already behind the wall. The young man only sighed and said that he expected nothing else from them. If they do not go, he will go himself, but then they should not forget to thank him for the work done. Suddenly a step sounded nearby. It was Lumiere, who was walking with a sword at the ready. She decisively declared that she would also go to fight the monsters beyond the walls. Together with Princess Hiram, he headed to the gate. As they passed the guards, they began mocking Lumiere, calling her an inept princess. Their mockery outraged the girl, but she restrained herself, not responding, and with her head held high, she moved on. When they approached the gates behind which a crowd of people was still begging for help, no one dared to stop them anymore. Hiram stood by the grate, smiled at the princess, then clenched the bars, tearing them from the stone fastenings. Iron beams crashed down with a rumble. The path was open, and they went out to meet the people. The people thanked them with smiles for the rescue. One boy, who had already reached the city, raised his hand and shouted that there was no need to worry anymore. Everyone who was supposed to be saved was already inside. Lumiere sighed with relief and said that now everything was fine, and in the future they could always rely on her and Hiram. The girl promised to destroy the monsters. Then Hiram took out a sword from the magic bag that he had once given her. Extending the blade, he handed it back to the princess. Gratefully accepting the weapon, Lumiere was the first to move toward the Orc Lord. Hiram stayed behind, allowing her to face the giant alone, whom she had not been able to defeat before. When the girl confidently approached, the orc finally noticed her. He turned his head and lazily glanced, assessing the opponent with a sword in her hands. To scare the heroine, the orc sharply struck a nearby building. The house shattered into pieces, and the ground trembled. Raising his huge hand to strike, the orc charged at Lumiere, but the girl boldly moved toward him, gripping Hiram's sword. This chieftain was much bigger than the one they had encountered on the way. For the princess, it became a real trial. The orc's strike shattered the ground, but she jumped back in time. Despite his size, the orc turned out to be surprisingly fast and incredibly strong. Lumiere tried to get close for a strike, but he began swinging his arms even faster. Realizing that it was hard to hit a small target, the orc started hitting the ground, raising stones and clumps of earth in all directions. Huge fragments flew toward the princess, but the girl proved to be extremely agile and managed to dodge all the stone rain pouring down on her. The princess long dodged the blows, but this only distanced her from the goal. Exhausted, falling to one knee, she leaned on her sword and breathed heavily. Focusing, Lumiere closed her eyes, holding the blade before her. She was preparing to use the power she had been learning in recent days together with Hiram. The blade in the girl's hands trembled as she imagined magic streaming through her whole body and gathering in her palms. Now control over the flows came much faster. Stones were still falling around. The orc was approaching with heavy steps, but the girl was already rising. Thin threads of magical energy began to sparkle around her. Lumiere remained motionless as the giant nearly reached her. The orc swung his arms, raising them to crush the delicate figure with one devastating blow. His palm slammed down on the spot where the girl was sitting. But at the last moment she jumped aside, saving herself from the blow that was meant to destroy her. Seizing the moment, Lumiere found herself behind the monster, which had spent all its strength on the previous strike and could not recover quickly. Swinging the blade, she passed low by the orc's legs, leaving bloody wounds on his massive limbs. The princess did not stop. With every movement, her body shone from the magical flow intertwined with the sword strikes. The injured legs could not bear the weight, and the orc fell to one knee. Lumiere was already preparing for the decisive leap. The target became closer. Now she could reach the head. In one jerk, the girl raised the sword and swung desperately. The head of the orc chieftain detached and fell to the ground. The body still swayed, but the magic in Lumiere's eyes slowly faded, bringing her out of the battle trance. Landing, she closed her eyes and froze for a moment. For the first time, she felt true power. And for the first time, she won thanks to magic. Realizing this triumph, the girl looked up and saw Giram coming towards her. Lumiere stood up, raising her hand with a victorious shout. Her eyes shone with happiness. All the efforts had finally borne fruit. Giram watched her fight attentively. Smiling, he rubbed his chin and admitted that she had indeed become much stronger. With a smile up to her ears, Lumiere rushed to him, not hiding her emotions. She said it was thanks to him, as he had become her mentor. Near the gate, the people who had been watching the battle erupted with joy. Children ran towards them, celebrating the victory of their princess. But Hiram suddenly became alert. He felt that the danger was not over yet. Raising his hand, he stopped the children, ordering them to turn back. His face darkened. "This is not the end yet," he said. Jorm, waving his paws, also urged the little ones to run to the city. Suddenly the ground trembled. Right above the orc's body, a black portal covered with pulsating symbols opened. He grew with every second, and Hiram, without taking his eyes off, shouted to the others to flee. Lumiere asked confusedly what it was, but a figure was already beginning to break out of the portal. It was a dragon, terrible, half-decayed. From the black gate crawled a massive carcass, ending with a tail. The monster fell heavily to the ground, raising a cloud of dust. His landing erased the remains of houses and scattered the earth around. Hiram and Lumiere stood very close. Aiming carefully, Hiram said with surprise, "This is an adult zombie dragon." Lumiere could not believe what she heard. The boy explained that although the dragon was dead, its soul was bound to the body, turning it into an undead. Giram himself could not understand where he had come from. He glanced at Jorm and asked if he knew this dragon. The boy only shook his head. Then Hiram looked at the princess again. She was frightened but had already gathered her courage, and this did not escape his attention. "Can you manage?" he asked. She answered with a tremble. "Yes." Lumiere turned to the dragon, examining it. It was the first time she had stood so close to such a creature. She had dreamed of driving out the dragon, but now, having encountered the undead, she did not know what to expect. Gathering her thoughts, Lumiere believed in her own strength. Training and control of magic flows gave her confidence. She looked at the dragon and said that this battle belonged to her. The monster swayed from side to side, gaped its jaws, and roared so loudly that its scream toppled everything around. The air and stones trembled from this roar. Giram rushed to the children who ran out beyond the city walls. The dragon stood on its hind legs and roared even louder, while Lumiere decisively launched an attack. Standing before the children like a wall, Hiram ordered them not to step out from behind his back, for the slightest step forward threatened death. The children covered their ears, trying to endure this terrible sound. Meanwhile, Lumiere, approaching the enemy, pushed off the ground and with the first strike hit his long neck with the sword. Dark blood splattered from the wound, but the blow was not enough to fell the beast. The dragon swiped its paw, throwing the princess aside. But Lumiere was more agile and faster. She dodged the attacks and gradually approached his head, forcing the monster to accelerate. Leaping accurately, she found herself right on his back. The goal was won. To reach the head, so there was no time to hesitate. Running along the wing toward the neck, she suddenly saw flames flare up in the mouth. The zombie dragon was preparing to unleash fire. A stream of flame burst out and rushed straight at her. Avoiding it was impossible. Only one choice remained. A solid wall of fire covered the ground and engulfed the girl. Yet through the gaps in the fiery stream, her figure standing on her feet was still visible. The children screamed in despair, thinking the princess was doomed. Even Giram and Yorm watched in surprise at what was happening. However, Lumiere withstood the stream, holding her sword in front of her. She remained unharmed, and with one jerk pushed back the flames, cutting a path for herself. The next moment she jumped up, right into the dragon's mouth, taking advantage of his mistake. He had let her get too close. Breaking free from the fire, Lumiere struck with all her might, and the blade gifted by Giram severed part of the monster's lower jaw. Landing, she did not take her eyes off the enemy. The beast went mad, black blood flowed from his wound, and he glared fiercely at the elf. Feeling the advantage, Lumiere continued the attack, while the dragon gathered fire again, hoping to burn her to ashes. Giram, seeing that she had withstood the fire stream, explained to the children, "If a hero can cut through the dragon's flames, then its roar has no power over him." The princess circled around the monster, leaving new and new cuts on its scales. Hiram noted that even dragon shell shields were nothing to the hero. He said it was no wonder why heroes have long been considered natural enemies of dragons. Jorm just grumbled that that was exactly why he did not like them. At some point the monster's tail struck her, and Lumiere's body was thrown toward the city buildings. She crashed into the roof, scattering the tiles, and the frightened screams of the children tore through the air again. The dragon, deciding that it had lost the princess, turned its gaze to the children running to Hiram and began preparing to attack. But Lumiere, fully conscious, was already getting up. She realized that the monster had lost interest in her and was now targeting the innocent. One of the girls stumbled and fell. The shadow of the dragon loomed over her. Lumiere only managed to scream, ordering to run. The flame rushed at the children. It seemed their fate was decided. They closed their eyes, preparing to accept the end. But the fire crashed into the magical shield covered with demonic symbols. The flames scattered in all directions, causing no harm. Lumiere did not see this, and thought that the children had already died. But Hiram controlled everything and managed to protect them. With a light movement, he created a barrier, the same kind that once held back young Jorm. The children looked at him as if he were a hero, and he only smiled and patted their heads. Having made sure they were safe, Hiram turned to the dragon. His eyes darkened, and he began gathering magic to put an end to this chaos. From the fire bursting from the dragon's maw, burning chains began to form, which with a crack rushed at the huge zombie dragon, squeezing its body. It resisted, but in vain. Chains woven from flames quickly wrapped around his wings, neck, and torso. The monster roared fiercely, struggling and flailing its paws. But the magic was stronger. Giram clenched his palm, and at that moment the fiery bonds tightened even more. The dragon, trying to rise into the sky, broke free and crashed onto its back, raising clouds of dust. He fought for some time longer, but the Demon King's strength unyieldingly crushed him, breaking his resistance. The unwilling creature writhed but was already doomed. Then Hiram called this princess's name. He wanted her to put the final dot. Lumiere was already rushing towards him, gripping the sword. She sharply pushed off the ground and flew upward, directing the blade toward the neck, where scraps of flesh barely clung to the bones. Magic flared around her body again, granting strength. Determination blazed in her gaze. This moment was meant to put an end to the cursed monster. The blade cut into the tough scales, scattering them with shiny dust. The sword widened the cut, advancing deeper and deeper. Drawing a circle around the neck, Lumiere shouted, gathered all her strength, and cut off the monster's head, which fell heavily to the ground. Exhausted, she leaned on the sword, barely catching her breath. Magic drained the body, but now she stood on a completely different level. And suddenly, from the depths of the beast's essence, a quiet voice of gratitude was heard. It was the soul of the dragon, which she had freed from chains. The monster's body fell silent, dark blood flowing onto the ground. Lumiere raised her head, gazing at the giant carcass. She bowed her head, wishing peace to the soul of an ancient enemy. It seemed strange to her that even the dragon thanked the hero. Footsteps behind her made her turn around. It was Giram with Yorm, and the demon smiled, calling her fight exceptional. The princess responded with a grateful smile. She understood. Without the training given by her teacher, this day would have ended differently. Their moment was interrupted by children's hugs. The little ones ran to their savior, not forgetting Giram. They thanked both, the heroine and the unknown traveler who shielded them from the flames. Giram only smiled gently and patted the boy on the head. He said that true glory belonged to the princess because she showed heroism and defeated the ancient dragon. Other townspeople were approaching the battle site. They looked at the monster's body, rejoiced that Lumiere was alive, and surrounded her with applause and words of gratitude. The princess shone in their eyes. The people's love, reinforced by the feat, elevated her to the level of a legend. Giram frowned and stepped aside. He understood well. There were no coincidences here. Someone deliberately set this trap. Yorm flew to his king. and he quietly said that this was yet another conspiracy against Lumiere. Without his intervention, the girl would have died. He suggested that at first she was supposed to be lured by a fight with the Orc Lord, and then a zombie dragon was thrown in as the fatal finale. But the plan failed, and this will surely anger the true enemy. Meanwhile, they found the Lord himself, who was sitting apart. He trembled, holding his head, and Giram approached, demanding an answer. But the Lord only muttered nonsense and shuddered all over, unable to utter a single clear word. Yorm looked at him suspiciously, and whispered that this elf seemed to have lost his mind. Giram only nodded grimly. Leaning closer, the demon used magic to check whether there was a seal or trace of black magic on the Lord. In a moment he confirmed. Indeed, a powerful curse was placed on him, masked so skillfully that not everyone could notice it. Yorm scratched his chin and asked why someone would curse the local ruler. Giram replied that most likely his speech was simply sealed. Giram noticed that it was not a simple spell but a special one. It had the character of demonic magic, very familiar to him. Yorm tried to see and understand something, but Giram just turned away and said it was time to go. The Lord was no longer fit for anything. Wasting time on him made no sense. The next day the sun rose brightly. As always, Giram and Lumiere trained in the morning, then sat to rest in the courtyard, enjoying a short pause. Lumiere stepped away briefly when a maid approached her. Together they disappeared into the house, and later the princess ran out smiling, holding a small envelope in her hands. She joyfully informed Giram that His Majesty was inviting him to the capital. The Demon King received this news gloomily. He immediately suspected treachery and asked why he was being called to the court. The princess explained that they want to officially honor and award him, but Hiram just shrugged, saying he hadn't done anything special. He reminded that everything happened too quickly. Only yesterday he defeated the dragon. Lumiere replied that for this, the capital has a special artifact of instant communication. The boy pondered. It seemed to him that this was just a pretext to lure him out. Yet at the same time, curiosity prevailed. Finally he agreed, but on one condition. Lumiere must go with him. He did not say that she was in danger, although there had already been 2 attempts on her life. Fortunately, the king himself ordered his daughter to accompany him, so the condition was fulfilled. Hiram smiled and said that in that case he agreed. The princess rejoiced and immediately went to get ready. Hiram thanked her and calmly finished his tea. Yorm, chewing the remains of breakfast, asked his king if he was sure about the decision. The capital is full of scoundrels. Hiram only nodded. He remembered all the recent events, bandits, the Orc Lord, the zombie dragon. Someone was persistently setting traps, but inside him burned the desire to find out what would happen next. His soul was seeking new adventures. When they finished milking, the carriage was already waiting by the entrance. The maids were loading the princess's belongings. Hiram stood up and told Yorm that it was time to depart. Meanwhile, on another continent, night enveloped the sky. Flocks of dragons circled above the Gothic palaces. The city was drowning in darkness. In the magnificent palace served demons, and it was immediately visible by their horns. On the throne sat the Dark Mistress, and she ordered to repeat what was said. The officer fell to his knees and spoke again. Hiram has been reborn in a human body, but the ruler did not believe it. It was Queen Irmgard, who sat on a throne made of the bones of her enemies. She was confirmed. The news was true. A murmur rose in the hall. One of the demons wearing glasses said that the magic of reincarnation was too complex. Even for Hiram, he could be mistaken. The strangest thing was that he chose the human race. This testified both to his desperation and his strength. One way or another, now he would become a problem for them. The queen pondered, but the cunning advisor in glasses stepped forward and bowed low. He said that Hiram must be destroyed. He raised his hand to his chest, asking permission to take the task upon himself. His voice rang with determination and ambition. He added that he already controlled the Orteal kingdom, where Hiram currently was. He himself must handle this task. Irmgard rose from the throne and looked attentively at the subordinate. She agreed but warned, the matter was extremely important. The man bowed low, thanking for the trust, and received the blessing. The queen slowly turned back. But before sitting down, she shouted, "Bring me his head as proof." And the advisor coldly confirmed, "It will be done." The reception ended. The demons dispersed. The queen headed to the balcony, past cages with monsters and captive creatures. She wondered, how could Hiram have resurrected at all? After all, the divine punishment spell was supposed to erase his essence, unless the change of race changed everything. The queen pondered for a long time as she stepped onto the balcony. She knew the human race could become dangerous if it harbored the soul of another creature. Such cases were rare but fateful. The railing cracked under her hands from anger. Learning that Giram was alive, Irmgard blazed with fury. She understood. he would return to reclaim the throne. A black aura swirled around the queen, and she shouted that Hiram had become a weakling, unworthy of being called the Lord of Demons. By changing his race, he lost the right to rule the continent. The demon who received the order did not dare to argue, and immediately set off for Ortale. His goal was clear: to find Giram in human form and kill him. Meanwhile, Giram with Lumiere and several of her servants made a halt. At night they lit a small fire to rest and regain strength. When everyone fell asleep, Yorm curled up by the fire. A bright flash lit up the camp. It was the magic of Giram himself. The princess woke up and, rising, sleepily looked at the sky. The glow from the fire spread through the forest, and she realized that the source of the light was not ordinary. It was Hiram, who stood with a necklace in his hands. He was trying again to find Filthy, using the power of the artifact. The stone in the pendant shimmered with a green glow, responding to his spell but not revealing the desired outcome. Hiram clenched his fingers, trying to hold back the flow of energy. After several futile attempts, he squeezed the pendant irritably. His heart filled with powerless anger. Suddenly a rustle was heard in the thicket. The boy turned sharply but saw only a familiar figure pushing through the branches. It was Lumiere. She came out to him and smiled. Hiram apologized, thinking he had woken her. The girl only shook her head in denial and asked what he was doing. The boy pointed at the necklace and confessed he had been trying to feel filthy for several hours. His voice sounded quiet, almost guilty. The princess opened her mouth in surprise and clapped her hands. She remembered his stories about the demoness and wanted to learn more. They returned together to the campfire. Hiram said there were no results yet, but it was not so simple. The princess tried to encourage him. She promised that she would help him in any way. The boy thanked her and wished her a good night. He added that by tomorrow noon they would already be in the capital, so they needed to rest. Lumiere smiled, looking at both him and Jorm, who was quietly snoring by the fire. She lay down again. Before closing her eyes, the girl whispered to him good night. Her thoughts were already painting a picture of their arrival at the royal palace. The next day their carriage rolled through the main gates of the capital. The city impressed with its grandeur, and the castle towers reached the sky. Jorm leaned out of the window and gazed enchanted at the beauty of the city. Dragons always valued grandeur and luxury, so he liked this place. But what caught Jorm's attention the most were the sweets and delicacies displayed in almost every shop. Statues of elves towered on the streets, flags fluttered, and carriages scurried along the streets. The life of the capital was bustling. Passing by a mansion, the princess suddenly exclaimed, "Her younger sister lived here." She immediately wanted to visit her. Hiram smiled and agreed that it was a good idea. Only Yorm sighed discontentedly. The princess was confident. Her sister would be very happy about the unexpected visit. The carriage turned off the main road and delved into narrow streets. The path led along clean cobblestones through luxurious gardens that opened before the traveler's eyes. Finally, the carriage stopped near the palace. The coachman announced their arrival. Lumiere quickly jumped out, impatiently awaiting the meeting. Meanwhile, Hiram carefully examined the estate. He asked if it was the princess's inheritance, but the girl replied that only her sister lived there. The doors opened and they entered a spacious hall. Hiram inquired why the sister lived separately. Lumiere explained that she was ill and undergoing treatment. Hiram also looked around attentively. The house impressed with luxury, as befitted a royal family residence, and the servants lined up in a neat row. The boy noticed that they all looked extremely composed and asked if they were all from this kingdom. The princess confirmed, explaining that they were specially trained. Hiram thought that with such appearance they definitely knew military affairs, but the princess objected with a smile. Not all of them were destined to become warriors. Soon, after passing several halls and corridors, they approached a room from which light was shining. A servant opened the door, and Lumiere said it was the chamber of her younger sister. Inside sat a little girl with golden hair, similar to Lumiere's hair. She lifted her head and looked joyfully at the guests. Tears appeared in her eyes. She could not believe she was seeing her older sister again, so alive and real. Lumiere immediately rushed to her, hugging tightly, pressing to her chest. Her voice trembled with joy. She had returned home. The younger sister also hugged Lumiere, confessing that she was happy to see her unharmed. The response was mutual and warm. Then the girl's gaze fell on Giram and Yorm, who were standing nearby. She asked with curiosity who these strangers were. Lumiere smiled and introduced her companions, Hiram and Yorm. The younger sister was named Selena. Giram waved his hand and smiled kindly. Selena carefully climbed down from the bed, gathering strength. Lumiere was worried because she knew how difficult even such movements were for her sister. Finally, Selena stood up, smoothed her dress, and bowed low to the guests. saying she was glad to meet them. She thanked them for caring for her older sister. Then, seeing the little dragon flying around the room, she opened her eyes in surprise. Giram explained that this was Yorm, an ancient dragon. Selena gasped in amazement and said she had only heard about them from legends and fairy tales. Yorm could not resist and spoke to the girl himself, asking if she was afraid of him. Selena was even more impressed that he could talk, but she smiled and assured that she was not afraid at all. Then Yorm, coquettishly arching, allowed her to pet him. The little dragon lay on the edge of the bed, and Selena gently stroked him, not believing she could touch a creature that others had only seen from afar. Lumiere and Giram smiled, watching how the sister rejoiced. Yorm grumbled contentedly and even shed a tear of tenderness. Wagging his tail, the dragon obediently lay down, and Selena raised her head and asked her sister how they met Giram. Lumiere hugged her and told that he saved her from bandits near the road. Selena exclaimed that she wanted to hear everything in detail. So they recalled their adventures for a long time. The fight with the Orc Lord, strange artifacts, and dangerous traps. Time passed unnoticed. Finally, Selena got tired and began to doze. Lumiere gently covered her sister with a blanket, and she was already almost asleep. Giram slowly walked around the room. Lumiere said she had never seen her sister so lively. He agreed and noted that rest would do her good. Approaching the window, he drew back the curtains. Lumiere sighed and said that doctors consider the disease almost incurable. Giram only squinted. He carefully added that he understands such things and already sees the cause of her ailment. These words sounded unexpected and made Lumiere cry out with joy. Giram, feeling the surfaces with his palms, used magic. Barely noticeable dust flakes rose in the air, as if from a lifted curse. Then he turned and said that the room chosen for Selena was very strange. The girl was surprised, as she considered it ordinary. At that moment, one of the servants bowed and announced that dinner was ready. Lumiere looked around. It was indeed already dusk. Yorm yawned loudly and declared that he was tired and wanted to sleep. He even slyly glanced at Selena's bed, as if intending to settle nearby. Lumiere asked about dinner, since after lunch they had eaten almost nothing. But Yorm grumbled that his nature did not require frequent meals. Giram only nodded approvingly. Hiram approached Yorm closer and said that he relied on him. The dragon whispered that he felt something strange in this house, so he would watch over little Selena himself. Hiram replied that he was also ready to go to dinner, so they left their sister with Yorm in the room. Going downstairs, they saw that the servants were already finishing the setting. The table was set for only two. Candles shone in the middle, and around them sparkled dishes worthy of a royal house. They were served sparkling wine, and at first they ate silently until Lumiere broke the silence. She asked if Hiram would go to the bath today. The boy glanced at the servant standing very close and nodded, saying that after long travels it would be appropriate. When dinner ended, he was brought washing things and led downstairs. The servants offered help, but Hiram immediately refused. In the center of the room stood a large tub full of hot water. The boy undressed, immersed himself, and threw his head back, exhaling deeply. Besides the bath, there was almost nothing in the room. That was exactly what Hiram needed, as he had long wanted to be alone. Leaning his back against the edge, he heard footsteps approaching. He thought his solitude was disturbed and even guessed. Maybe it was the killer. Focusing, he listened tensely. Magic was already flowing through his body, ready to burst out at any moment. When the footsteps came very close, he suddenly stood up and stretched out his hand, preparing to strike the uninvited guest. Turning around, he could not believe his eyes. A princess stood before him. Lumiere herself was frightened by his sudden movement. Giram quietly uttered her name, waiting for explanations. The girl, however, looked down, hesitating to tell the truth. The boy silently looked at her, not rushing. He already suspected that she had not come here in vain. He placed his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to look him in the eyes. Lumiere trembled, not understanding what he would do next. But Giram only gently turned her toward the door. He did not want to see anyone now, and wanted to return to peace. Stepping back a few steps, he was the first to speak. He asked why she was here. A thought appeared in his mind. If she dared to do this, she must have something very important to say, something that could not be discussed publicly. He changed his tone so as not to pressure her and asked her to honestly tell about her problem. Lumiere lowered her head and whispered that it was about Selena. She had one request for him. The girl said she was afraid for her sister. If something happened to her, Selena would be defenseless. She timidly raised her eyes and asked that then Giram become a support for her younger sister. The boy sighed deeply and assured her that she could rely on him completely. He did not tell her that he already felt danger in this house, so as not to scare her prematurely. Lumiere raised moist eyes to him. Tears glistened on her eyelashes, and she asked once again if he would really protect Selena. Hiram firmly confirmed this. She hugged him from behind, thanking him for everything he had already done for her. More than an hour passed, and Hiram came out of the bathhouse calm and restored. Now it became clear to him why the girl did not even trust her own father. A servant was already standing by his clothes, politely offering clean linen. Hiram accepted, understanding that he was being watched continuously. Another servant offered to escort him to the chambers. They walked down a long corridor until they reached heavy doors. Opening them, Hiram went inside. The room turned out to be extremely simple. Bare stone walls, iron bars on the windows, and almost nothing else. Hiram felt that this room too much resembled a prison. He silently examined the walls until the servant who had escorted him left, wishing him a good night. The boy thought that Selena was definitely not safe in such a place. Everything around reminded him of a building for prisoners, even the very architecture of the estate, but there was no point in complaining. Overall, the evening went well. A luxurious dinner, a hot bath. Hiram lay down on the bed and yawned loudly. His eyelids grew heavy, and he began to feel sleepy. He suspected that something might have been slipped into the wine, but decided that the main thing now was to rest and regain strength. The last thought before sleep was about how to get out of this trap. If he removed the seal, he would immediately give himself away. When he fell into a deep sleep, a quiet rustle was heard from the depths of the wing. Someone was cautiously approaching his room. The door creaked open, and a narrow strip of light fell on the stone floor. On the threshold stood a man in a dark cloak with a dagger under his arm. He stepped quietly so as not to wake Hiram and raised the blade, preparing to strike. The Demon King was sleeping deeply. Even the light in the stranger's breath did not make him move. The killer raised the weapon above his head, seconds separating Hiram from death. The black blade slowly descended, aimed at the boy's chest. The blade almost touched, cutting only the shirt, but suddenly a tremor stopped the strike. Hiram had already woken up but did not open his eyes. The steel only slid over the fabric. The attacker's hands trembled, not daring to deliver the fatal blow. Hiram opened his eyes and coldly said that they had finally dared to take his life. He was calm, confident in the outcome. He recognized the weapon. From under the cloak came muffled sobs. Hiram got up and saw a woman's hands on the blade. He gently asked what had happened. Grasping the hilt, he pulled the hood aside. Before him stood Lumiere, all in tears, not knowing what to say. Hiram held the sword, and she did not let go. Then he asked why she had stopped, since she could have killed if not for hesitation. Lumiere trembled and only repeated apologies. She released the dagger and handed it to Hiram. But suddenly she pulled a dagger from behind her back. The boy froze, not understanding what she had planned. The princess was not going to strike him. She aimed the tip at her own chest, saying that she trusted this to Selena. She took a heavy breath and was already raising the dagger to stab herself, ready to die. But Hiram managed to knock her hand away, and the blade fell to the floor. She remained unharmed. The princess fell to her knees, sobbing. Hiram bent down and asked if the chancellor was to blame for everything. And from her reaction, he understood. He guessed right. He spoke aloud what he had already put together in his head. She was ordered to kill him in exchange for medicine for Selena. Lumiere confessed that her sister's illness was incurable without a special remedy that the chancellor had promised to provide. She could not refuse, but she also could not kill Hiram because she had grown attached to him in her heart. Hiram sighed and said that this was exactly why she considered herself hopeless. She was tormented by shame, and that was why she wanted to shorten her life. He added that suicide would be a senseless and foolish act. She cried again, scattering apologies. He looked at her for a long time without emotion, then barely smiled and said that he understood everything and held no grudge. He bent down and gently said that Selena was already saved. Lumiere lifted her head with eyes wet from tears. She gasped, not understanding how this was possible. After all, everyone considered this illness incurable. Hiram glanced around the room and said that even then, after examining Selena, he understood. The illness was not natural, but a deliberate curse. He explained to Lumiere that when he examined his sister, his movements were not accidental. Even then, he was trying to remove the seal disguised as an illness. The Demon King took the princess's hands in his own, reminding her that she had already seen the power of his healing, and asked her to trust him further. After listening to him, the girl began to cry again. Hiram smiled gently and asked if she believed him, but Lumiere could not utter a word for a long time. Only through sobs she exclaimed that she wanted to believe, because healing her sister had always been her cherished dream. Her heart was breaking with fear for Selena. Hiram lifted her from the floor and whispered, if she trusted him, she must rely on him and move forward together. He began to treat her wounded hand, but suddenly the door was smashed open with a crash and armed soldiers burst into the room. They were royal knights clad in armor. They immediately surrounded Hiram and the princess, as if preparing to seize them. One of them shouted to Lumiere that a message had arrived about an assassination attempt on the king's guest, and suspicion had fallen on her. The princess was stunned, not understanding what was happening, and Hiram thundered that they must not dare to break in without permission. The knight replied that the young man better not interfere, because they had orders to immediately take the girl. But the demon king was not going to allow them to do so. He stepped forward before Lumiere and said that the matter must be resolved only by a court in the presence of the king himself. The knights howled with outrage, drawing their swords, believing that the young man was talking nonsense. The air smelled of battle. They rushed at him with weapons, certain that he was powerless in just a nightshirt. But Hiram unleashed his magic. He thundered in a demonic voice, ordering them to get out of the way, calling them lower creatures. It sounded like an absolute command. And a miracle happened. All the warriors instantly fell to their knees. Their swords dropped from their hands. They froze in submission before him. Lumiere sat on the floor, clutching the blade that Hiram had once given her. The boy extended his hand to her and said it was time to go together. She mustered her strength, stood up, and agreed to go with him. Her spirit was strengthened beside this teacher. Running out of the chambers, they headed to Selena's room. Hiram said that tomorrow they would have to appear before the king anyway, but now it was important to reach the sister. Lumiere was worried whether a guard had been posted at her door, because then Selena could also be in danger. Approaching the corridor, they saw broken doors and a smashed wall. Lumiere rushed forward, shouting her sister's name. In the room above Selena's bed stood a huge dragon, roaring fiercely at the frightened servants and guards who lay defeated. He ruled over everything, and the helpless people only shuddered and hid from his gaze. Hiram was the first to enter and immediately praised Jorm for accepting his true form. Lumiere could not believe her eyes at what she saw. Seeing Selena under the blanket, the princess rushed to her. Jorm, hovering over the bed, assured that the girl had not a scratch. Lumiere, through tears, hugged her sister, who peeked out from under the cover and said she felt fine. The sisters pressed against each other, crying with relief. Hiram approached the bed and asked Selena how she felt. The girl smiled and replied that she did not feel any pain. The boy gently stroked her head, said he was glad to hear that, but it was time to rest. With one spell, he plunged her into a deep sleep. Lumiere smiled sincerely for the first time in a long while. Hiram added that there was no trace left of the illness. She only needed sleep, and tomorrow they would set out on the road. Lumiere looked long at her sleeping sister, and whispered that the main thing was that Selena was alive and safe. She prayed for this and felt true relief. Slowly coming to her senses, Lumiere raised her head and thanked Jorm and Hiram for their help, while the Demon King sat on a stone, lost in heavy thoughts. Jorm leaned toward his king and asked what he was thinking about, as he felt something was wrong and an explanation was needed. Hiram admitted that he had previously considered the premier an enemy, but now suspected that someone else was involved in this matter, someone he did not yet know. The dragon exclaimed in surprise, as he was convinced that the premier himself had organized everything, seeking to seize power and wealth. But Hiram replied that although this was likely, the coincidence of circumstances was too suspicious, as if everything had been arranged in advance. He added that the premier did not care at all whether the assassination attempt succeeded, because in any case Lumiere would have been removed and his goal achieved. Lumiere looked at him in surprise and asked him to repeat, because she barely understood the meaning of his words. Hiram placed his hand on her shoulder, smiled gently, and said that he would immediately go to the minister and dot all the I's. The princess timidly asked if he would even wait for them. Hiram laughed and replied that he was obliged to receive them in any case. Hearing this, Lumiere straightened up and exclaimed passionately that she would go with him, because it concerned not only her but the whole country. Jorm and Lumiere watched Hiram intently as he summoned magic, saying that before leaving, there was still something to do. He warned the princess that on the way the minister had probably set many traps, and they must act carefully to survive. Looking at her, Hiram noticed how the girl suddenly became shy, lowering her head, and looked at her questioningly. She admitted that she had been naive and still did not understand how serious a danger threatened her family. The young man placed his hand on her shoulder, instilling confidence, and said that from now on she could rely on him. He would help her resolve this struggle. With a voice that gained strength, he added that the princess was not to blame for this, and the prime minister, most likely, had long been cooperating with demons. Lumiere and Jorm froze, waiting for explanations. The dragon asked why he thought so. Hiram replied that, first of all, the case with the zombie dragon, because that magic clearly did not belong to this kingdom. And also, the curse in Selena's chambers was demonic, so he immediately recognized it, feeling a familiar trace inside. Having finished the explanation, Giram created a magical barrier around Selena's cradle. The bright glow illuminated the ruined room. He lifted the cradle, carrying it to a protected place so that during their absence no one could touch the girl. When everything was ready, he returned to the princess and the dragon, saying that now, having ensured Selena's safety, it was time to visit the minister. Approaching Yorm, Giram asked for permission to ride on him. The dragon laughed and immediately agreed. The princess rejoiced at such a prospect, and Yorm extended his paws and carefully lifted his king and his companion, joking that it was the first time he was carrying her highness. Leaving Selena in her chambers under the protection of magic, they soared into the night sky on the wings of the ancient fire-breathing dragon. Giram enjoyed the speed, while Lumiere, pressing against Yorm's paw, clenched her sword and was afraid of falling down. The dragon flew over the night city, and in a few minutes the towers of the majestic palace rose ahead. Giram looked ahead, considering the plan. He could not burst straight inside on the dragon's back. Lumiere sat, clutching the paw, gripping her sword, while Giram carefully watched the palace approach and calculated every step. A cold determination froze on her face. In her heart there was nothing left but a thirst for revenge for the humiliation and suffering of their family. But despite all her zeal, Lumiere's hands trembled as she gripped the blade. Anxiety tore her from within, and even thoughts of her little sister only added to the torment. Giram saw that the princess was tense and understood. She was worried about the consequences. At court, he would have to be especially careful. To lighten the mood, he jokingly asked if she knew where the premier was now. The girl replied, "He was supposed to be at the ball at the royal court." Giram smiled, saying that was the perfect place for a trap. Lumiere explained that the ball was organized by her uncle, the Archduke, for all the nobility. The young man immediately declared his target was only the premier. The rest did not matter. He suggested Lumiere stay aside to avoid risking her name, because accusations against the second person in the state were too serious. But the princess firmly said she would go with him. Then Giram lifted her in his arms and added that he was relying on luck by allowing her to accompany him. Reaching the edge of Jorm's paw, he bent down and sharply stepped down. The princess screamed in surprise, not understanding his plan, while Giram remained calm. The free fall rapidly gained speed. Pressing against him, Lumiere trembled, and the demon king only barely smiled, fully controlling the flight. The palace quickly approached. Giram chose a target, the upper floor with gardens and towers, where windows were lit. Patrols were lurking around, and inside a celebration was raging. The ground drew closer. Lumiere gripped him tighter, eyes closed, while he already extended his leg for a soft landing. Magic absorbed the impact, the grass only shuddered. The guards stared in confusion and immediately rushed toward them. Noticing this, Lumiere stepped forward, raised her hand, and solemnly declared that she would take all responsibility. Her voice sounded confident, as if dispelling any doubts. Taking a few steps forward, she placed her hand on her chest and introduced herself as the commander of the 3rd Detachment of the Night Order, arrived on an important mission to the minister. But one of the guards brazenly laid his hand on her shoulder, saying that even a princess is forbidden entry without an invitation. The second supported him, demanding she leave. Giram immediately intervened. He grabbed the hand of the guard who touched the princess and threw him aside with a look that chilled the blood. Another tried to object, but Giram twisted his arm, coldly adding that no one had asked him for permission. Then he pulled Lumiere forward. The guards rushed after them, shouting and yelling, thereby stirring all the guests in the hall, who turned around in surprise at the noise. The festive hall fell silent, eyes focused on the princess and her companion. Everyone was struck by her appearance at such a late hour. Meanwhile, the guard hastily surrounded them, closing the circle. The onlookers merely watched, not intervening, not risking taking Lumiere's side. And suddenly a commanding voice sounded from above. The Prime Minister descending the stairs, demanding explanations for this disorder. He came down and coldly declared that the princess was acting extremely rudely by crashing his ball without an invitation. Looking at the pair, he feigned politeness and asked her about such unacceptable behavior, emphasizing every "Your Highness." Lumiere decisively replied that she had not come to entertain herself but was seeking a conversation with him. Meanwhile, Giram scanned the area, sensing hidden traps. The minister, surveying the guests with his gaze, shifted his eyes to the young man with dark hair and spoke his name. Giram, as if he had long awaited the meeting. Demon King did not pretend to be polite. He praised the minister for the courage to appear himself and immediately threw down a challenge. "If you want to kill me, try it right now." The Prime Minister, leaning on an elegant cane staff, calmly replied that there was no need to get nervous. He said, no matter what the princess said, he did not intend to kill anyone. He approached Giram almost face to face. Guards had already surrounded them, and court magicians stood behind, holding their staffs at the ready. The minister squinted and said that the boy was quite talented for a simple human lineage. He promised him safety if he renounced the princess and swore to serve him. But Giram answered firmly. He was not a servant, and moreover, he did not need any protection. His goal was different, and the minister would soon find out what it was. His gaze became icy. He thundered that now he was the one asking the question, and asked directly, "Did the minister enjoy poisoning the second Princess Orderval?" The minister pretended not to understand anything. Giram burst out shouting, accusing the minister of conspiring with demons. The courtiers gasped, and he added that the minister had been a general in the Demon King's army. The minister turned pale, began to stammer, and demanded proof, asking if the youth dared to disgrace his name in the middle of the palace. Giram stepped forward, forcing the guards to lower their blades. He disdainfully said that such pathetic weaklings as the minister were only pawns for the demons. The minister exploded with a shout, calling the words nonsense. Then Giram directed magic to his hand, declaring that the minister's death would become a problem even for the demonic army. His voice sounded like thunder. The youth released a bright flash of power, warning that the death of this lord would inevitably bring the demon army right to the walls of the capital. The minister became furious, waved his hand, ordering to wipe the insolent one who dared to challenge the second person of the kingdom off the face of the earth. Mages behind his back raised their wands and released dozens of fireballs towards Giram. The fire flew at him, ready to tear his body to pieces, but the young man stood unshaken. The flames engulfed him, yet he did not even think of retreating. The explosion shook the palace. Part of the floor collapsed. Guests fled in panic, shielding women and children from the debris. Lumiere froze, staring into the clouds of dust where her ally had just stood. The guards took steps forward, certain it was all over. The minister complacently lowered his eyes and said he had only destroyed a minor insect, an exemplary case for everyone. But when the dust cleared, a hand in a black glove emerged. Giram came out unharmed, saying that such forces could not defeat him. He shook the ash off his clothes, and the entire hall froze in amazement, seeing how a man withstood the blows of the court mages. The minister shouted in horror that it was impossible, since even elves would not survive such a blow. Giram only smiled. The guards charged forward again, and he shouted that the minister himself had collaborated with demons and was now trying to hide the truth. The clash erupted instantly. Giram scattered the warriors with his bare hands, every move deadly and precise. Mages and soldiers fell to the ground like paper figurines, while the young man stepped forward toward the main culprit. Giram loudly accused the minister of holding the elder princess hostage and forcing her to strike at his life. One of the mages fell right onto the lord, knocking him down the stairs. The minister screamed in frenzy, demanding to destroy Giram immediately. But the next moment the young man was already standing over him, pressing his foot into the minister's chest and pinning him to the marble. Giram said with a cold smile that the punishment for such crimes would be harsh, that he would repay him with torment and humiliation. He added that the end would not come soon. The minister would beg for death, and only then would he receive it. In despair, the lord touched the bracelet with the dark stone. The artifact flashed with a black glow, exploding with streams of magic. The minister screamed with an inhuman voice, his clothes tearing to pieces, and a wave of light and darkness threw Giram backward. The lord called the name Olgana, one of the 4 heavenly lords. His body rose above the stairs, twisted and deformed, black slime splashing around. Lumiere grabbed her sword, preparing for battle. Squinting, Giram disdainfully remarked that the methods of the 4 heavens were a tasteless theater by which demons spoil this country. In a moment, before everyone stood not the minister but a monster, his body swollen, covered with growths, as if from an otherworldly horror. The reborn lord laughed, declaring that in this form he felt omnipotent. Giram coldly retorted that only an idiot would call such a monstrosity demonic. The hall exploded with screams. Elves looked in shock as their leader turned out to be a traitor. He raised his giant hand and ordered everyone to bow before the new lord, swearing allegiance to the demon army. One of the witnesses behind Lumiere shouted that now everything was clear. The premier had collaborated with the forces of the Demon King from the start. He asked why he had betrayed his own land. The minister growled ominously, declaring that this was his revenge. He was despised for human blood, although he had done more for the country than anyone else. The demons promised him the throne if he conquered all the lands. Lumiere shouted that she did not understand why he then needed her in Selena. The lord replied with a cold smile that Olga herself had commanded it, and he was only carrying out the order. He added that no matter how long they survive, it changes nothing for him. He will either execute them or throw them into prison to gain recognition and glory from his lord. Hearing these words, Hiram looked at the princess and asked if there were any more questions. She only clenched her sword and said she had heard enough. The boy turned to the minister and coldly declared that it was time for the monster and the former prime minister to say goodbye to life. He burst out laughing, calling the young man a miserable person, and exclaimed that in his current form he could easily defeat even an ancient dragon. Hiram smiled and asked if he even understood who he was talking about. But the demon could no longer tolerate the mockery. His gigantic body moved in time with the original. He clenched his fist, covered it with dark magic, and ordered the young man to be silent. The strike was lightning fast. The stone floor shattered when the fist fell near Hiram, scattering fragments in all directions. A powerful wave destroyed the tower walls, raising a thunder that reached even the distant districts of the capital. The minister, bursting outside through the breach, roared, demonstrating his strength. Lumiere rushed to cover her parents who stood nearby. Climbing to the highest tower, Lord unfolded small wings and shouted that he would burn these lands to the ground, then burst into mad laughter. His face distorted, fangs appeared. He shouted that the life of the elves would become a beautiful sacrifice for the demonic king. But suddenly a foreign word sounded behind. A voice threw that the demon king does not need such a gift from a miserable slave, a puppet without free will. The minister turned and was stunned. On a thin spire stood Hiram, alive and smiling. The Lord did not believe it, but decided to finish off the enemy. The boy stood calmly, looking at him like a worthless jester, incapable of true power. The demon opened his jaws and growled, calling Hiram a miserable man who has no right to challenge him. In his palms, a black sphere of magic condensed, rapidly growing, threatening to turn everything around to ashes. The ball of darkness was getting bigger and bigger, and the Lord aimed it directly at the youth. Hiram did not move from his place. Swinging, the demon threw the sphere forward. It crashed into the place where Hiram stood, exploding with streams of darkness. But the boy stopped it with one hand, pushed it away, and sharply threw it back. The ball hit the Lord himself, knocking him off the roof. He held in the air only thanks to his wings. The demon hovered in the air, wildly waving his tail. He could not believe that his own attack had turned against him. Blood appeared on his lips. He coughed and looked at Hiram, approaching with horror. The youth hovered in the air, spreading his arms, and introduced himself. Before him stands Hiram, the true king of demons. He added that for such a degenerate it would be an honor to die at the hand of the true lord of demons. Raising his hand, Hiram began to form an aura. The demonic body of the minister trembled in the air, supported by pathetic wings. The glow of power around the boy grew. He calmly, slowly approached. In the Lord's gaze, full of hatred, a shadow of fear was already hiding. The minister tried to gather himself, preparing for a strike or defense, but hesitated because he could not match the speed. Hiram dashed forward like lightning and, changing position, struck him right in the face, pouring all his strength into the movement. The huge demon's body flew into the tower wall, broke through it, and crashed inside. The people below screamed and rushed to flee from the debris. But, as Hiram promised, he intended to give the former minister a slow and painful death, so he was in no hurry to put an end to this fight. The demon, having broken through the wall and found himself in the tower, was hit from behind by a huge fiery projectile that destroyed the top of the structure. He barely managed to raise his hands. For a moment, he thought he had held back the stream of flames, but at that time Hiram calmly approached, taking advantage of his powerless struggle. Climbing onto the debris of the destroyed tower, the boy jumped onto the thin wall and began circling around the Lord, catching bloody drops with his hand. It was the blood of the former prime minister, which he had not yet noticed. Hiram continued moving with a smile, enjoying his humiliation. The Lord finally felt terrible pain and, looking back, saw that half of his body was already gone. He could not comprehend how it had happened. Choking on blood, the demon croaked that he did not understand how a worthless human managed to pierce his flesh. He staggered and fell down from the tower. The huge body hit the ground, raising a cloud of dust. The elves began to gather closer. The demon tried to get up, leaving pools of blood on the stone floor. His groan was pitiful. He realized his own defeat. Coughing and spitting out bloody clots, he shouted that he did not understand where exactly he had made a mistake, having such power. The elves surrounded him, shouting that the premier had betrayed the homeland and was no longer worthy of any respect. The Lord, leaning on his hand, barked for everyone to be silent. He declared that each of them was also guilty because they silently helped him. He added that soon Olgan's army would be teleported here, and then it would be the end for everyone. His eyes blazed with rage. He looked around the crowd, continuing to laugh as if he had completely gone mad. But the end was near. Hiram snapped his fingers, and the demon fell, breathing heavily and folding his wings. His Majesty, together with Lumiere and several servants, stood nearby. The king said he had witnessed a disgusting spectacle and could not imagine that he had raised such a snake near himself. Suddenly, guards ran in with news. A large magical circle was found northeast of the palace, from which monsters were emerging. The warriors insisted on urgently evacuating the peaceful residents of the city and those who lived beyond its walls. Jérôme grabbed Lumière and led her to the wall, where he saw a huge teleport shimmering with every moment. The Prime Minister's words turned out to be true. The servants panicked, shouting that it was time to flee, begging the king to appeal to the archdukes for protection, and even suggesting surrender. But Jérôme stepped forward and loudly declared that everyone must remain calm. He promised to defend the capital, and the people could hide in the city. Some doubted that he could manage alone, but the young man only smiled and urged everyone to behave like good children until he dealt with the enemy. The princess supported him, reminding that everyone had already seen Jérôme's power. She solemnly assured the people that today he would surely win. These words gave the people faith. Even among the ruins they began to smile, holding on to hope for a peaceful tomorrow. Jérôme raised his head and called his dragon. The time for the real battle had come. On mighty wings came Jorm, raising the wind. The ancient dragon finally got a chance to show his power. He hovered near the tower, holding onto a ledge. The people froze in fear, but the dragon only looked down at them. Jorm bent over the royal family and servants, and Jérôme calmly stood, waiting for him to lower his head so he could mount. The ancient dragon flew up to his master. Jérôme looked up and said it seemed the Demon King's army was already here, and it was time to meet it in battle. Jorm roared joyfully, lowering his head. Jérôme and Lumière climbed onto his neck, grabbing the thick scales. When they settled, the young man stroked the dragon and gave the order to depart. The dragon began to cautiously rise into the sky, spreading its huge wings, and asked about the direction. The king ordered to fly northeast. Jorm nodded and rushed toward the portal, from which dark spots were incessantly bursting out. These were monsters falling to the ground. The stream of creatures did not stop for a moment. The portal worked continuously, throwing out new servants of darkness. Jorm flew with all his might. An army of invaders was already gathering in the clearing, forming a circle, leaving space for new waves coming out of the gate. Among the monsters were orcs familiar to the princess and numerous beasts in bone armor, created for war. Jorm flew over the crowd, and Jérôme carefully studied the enemy army. The servants of General Olgan, mostly subdued orcs from the demonic continent. The boy noted that Olgan's transformation magic had borne fruit. The soldiers' bodies were reworked to become the most convenient puppets. Lumière, trembling, said that the sight was terrifying. The dragon asked if it was worth burning everything with fire. Jérôme replied that there was no time to wait. He ordered Jorm to act without mercy. The dragon opened its jaws, gathering fire. A firestorm crashed down. The orcs melted and fell like wax in a flame, and Jorm broke through further, burning everything in his path. Monsters continued to come out of the portal, but the dragon had already managed to turn most of the army to ashes, surrounding the landing site with rings of flame. The princess exclaimed, impressed by the dragon's power. Jérôme said that the ancients are the embodiment of natural disasters, and that is why they are scarier than armies. But soon much larger creatures began to come out of the portal. Dragons appeared, and behind them, a creature with several heads. It was Olgan himself, general of the demon army, who rode a hydra in bone armor into the world. Jorm did not wait and struck with flame at the flying dragons, burning part of their army in the sky, but most remained unharmed. Olgan was covered with a shield similar to the one Jérôme once used to defend himself in the cave. Now the general's power was truly tangible. The general, smiling, mockingly called Jorm weak. The dragon blushed with shame, but the king ordered him not to listen. Jérôme firmly said that his opponent here was only the general, and that he himself would deal with him. Lumière was truly worried for the first time. She felt that for the first time in their kingdom appeared an enemy equal in power to the Demon King. Her fear was well-founded. Jorm, circling, asked the master if he knew this demon. Jérôme smiled and confirmed he knew and was already waiting to meet him. Descending down, stepping on air thanks to magic, Jérôme ordered Jorm to destroy the monsters around, and the princess to finish off those who escaped the fire. The dragon obediently bowed his head, and the king smiled, saying he relied on both of them. Jorm roared joyfully, confident in victory. Lumière also responded, though hesitantly, for her heart was still gripped by anxiety. When his allies moved to carry out the order, Jérôme turned his gaze to the general. Olgan was also moving towards him. Standing on the back of the Hydra, he recognized in Jérôme the former Lord of Demons, and mockingly said that turning into a human had become his disgrace. Jérôme calmly replied that he did not need the loyalty of such base creatures who commit dishonorable acts. Naming the general by name, Jérôme looked at him coldly. Olgan flared up with rage. Looking him straight in the eyes, Jérôme made the enemy feel that he was recognized and would no longer hide behind titles. Olgin thundered, asking why he had named him, but Giram just smiled. He remembered everything, and this angered the demon even more. Then Giram added that Olgin was only the 4th secretary at the court during his reign, and this miserable position did not make him worthy of being a general. Olgin, younger and looking completely different, was still recognized by Giram. Trembling with rage, he replied that he considered it an honor to be remembered. Giram smiled, saying that the Demon King does not forget his servants, and this angered the general even more. Olgin roared, demanding that no more nonsense be spoken. His anger grew. Words poured out like fire. He exclaimed that Giram still considered himself a lord, although he could not imagine how the demons survived the last 500 years. He recalled how 5 centuries ago Giram killed their god, and since then they lost divine protection, and their magic weakened day by day. Then the demons ruled over many races. But after the battle, all the neighbors saw a chance and rose up against the weakened lords. In just a few years, the demons lost most of their lands, including Ortevel, their heart and pride. Deprived of strength, they could not hold back the uprising and were forced to retreat, becoming fugitives. Olgin shouted that they, the former rulers of the world, now lived like rats on a tiny continent, all because of Giram. He roared that they had lost magic, lost lands, and all because of Giram's selfish desire to confront the demon god in battle. Olgin squeezed out a scream that Giram had no right to be called Demon King anymore after abandoning his people. Giram listened silently, then suddenly replied quietly that there were exactly 100 every day. This confused the general. And then Giram explained. The divine protection that demons so desired came at a terrible price. 100 lives daily, even children's. His predecessor made these sacrifices to the demon god, and everyone considered it normal. It was a true genocide of their own people. Giram, raising his head, burst out shouting, asking Olgin if he had ever thought about what it was like to watch brothers die. But the general replied that it was an honorable sacrifice because the common folk would never have expected such an honor. Giram cut him off, calling it blasphemy and betrayal. He declared that it was an unforgivable crime of a commander, and the only atonement was death. Olgin laughed mockingly, asking if Giram really wanted to kill him. He called the man a vile creature who could not defeat the general. Giram only mockingly invited him to come closer and check for himself how supposedly weak he was. The general ordered the dragons to prepare. Olgin roared that he was one of the 4 heavenly kings, and no man could defeat him. The dragons opened their jaws, gathering flames. A stream of fire burst from several jaws at once and covered Giram with a continuous firestorm. He remained standing, calmly concentrating the magical flow, preparing to defend. The flames engulfed him completely, and Olgin looked with triumph, thinking this time it was the end. But Giram raised a shield, and the fire flowed around him, causing no harm. Olgin snapped his fingers, giving another signal. Behind Giram appeared 2 giant demons with axes, ready to cut him to pieces. But he turned swiftly and sliced them in half with the power of magic alone. At that moment, one of the dragons lunged at him, roaring, with horns on its head created by twisted magic. The dragon swallowed Giram, but in a moment its skull split in half, and a bloody wave burst out. Giram emerged holding the demon's axe, having cut the monster apart. A crowd of monsters rushed into a chaotic attack. Orcs, altered bodies, even other dragons. Giram scattered them, while Olgin prepared to strike. Standing behind the shield, Giram looked at the general and smiled, showing he was not weakened at all. Olgin frowned and made a finger gesture. Giram turned around. Several dragons were already below, preparing to unleash a new blast of flames. Giram rushed forward and crashed into the ground, cutting through everything in his path. A powerful explosion raised a wave that shattered everything beneath it. Rising from the dust, he leaned on his hand, and with a smile noted that the general's attack was well planned. But for Olgin, this was not enough. He flew on his hydra, a giant paw reaching out to grab Giram to bind his movements. The Demon King managed to jump back and dodged. Then the general ordered the dragons to accumulate fire inside. And then the 3 heads of the hydra unleashed fire on the opponent. The general, shouting with hatred, already imagined the enemy's death and began to bring down the beast. But from the smoke emerged the figure of Giram, standing on his feet, only slightly sunk into the ground. He mockingly asked if the general's worthy strikes were over. Olgin's voice trembled, but he tried to convince himself and others that it was not over yet. In response, Giram unleashed a magical vortex, directing it at the enemy. A powerful whirlwind covered both the general and his 3-headed monster, tearing stones and air around. Giram smiled wider and wider, plunging into the frenzy of battle. For him, it was a matter of honor, to prove Olgin's worthlessness. The aura crashed down on the general and the hydra, pushing them back. Attempts to change course were futile. The explosion tore the air. The general only managed to cover his face with his hands and scream. Yorm circled over the field, burning hordes of monsters from the portal. The general's hydra slammed into the ground, leaving a crater behind. Stones flew in all directions. Jorm, laughing, commented that nothing else could be expected from the king. The princess felt a magical breath from the fall and whispered the name Giram. A dark spot spread where the beast fell, and magic swirled over the ruins. The general was covered by one of the subordinate demons, but he himself stepped forward, denying the defeat. He proclaimed that he is Algon Chaptoy, the head of the 4 heavenly kings of the demon army. Wheezing and losing blood, he heard the voice of Hiram, who disappointedly noted, Olgan's strength remained the same as 500 years ago. Giram accused him of stagnation. He only relied on the deity, achieving nothing himself. The general got angry but could not deny the obvious. The demon king descended closer and declared that, as a former subject, he grants him mercy, a swift death. Olgan coughed up blood and ominously asked if Giram has a daughter. Giram said the name Filthy in surprise, and the general laughed, confirming his guess. The demon king became wary. Something was wrong, but he had to find out the truth. Olgan grabbed the amulet with the skull and declared that he would fulfill Hiram's wish. The treasure gleamed, symbols of demonic magic flashed in the sky, and the general chuckled ominously. Raising the amulet, he opened the portal. Powerful magic burst out, illuminating everything around. Hiram lifted his head and thought that it might be the god of demons himself. He was filled with surprise, and he asked Olgan what all this meant. He shouted that this was his most precious gift. Hiram's daughter, Lady Filthy. Chains and the silhouette of the deity emerged from the portal. The god's body appeared fully. Streams of mana shook the earth, and every step scorched everything beneath his feet. Hiram could not believe his eyes. The demon god had been reborn earlier than he had assumed. At that moment, his amulet, which was linked to Filthy, flared with bright green flames. The connection confirmed. The girl was nearby. He grabbed the pendant, feeling it tremble. His heart filled with a premonition of horror. The general, enjoying himself, boasted about his skill in transformation and strengthening bodies. He laughed, declaring that Filthy had become a vessel for the soul of their god. Allegedly, this was the greatest honor for Hiram's child. Olgan bragged that he had made her the most powerful creature. Hiram's face was distorted by fierce hatred. In anger, his body once again grew the horns of the past. The demon king roared the traitor's name and charged at him with all his might.